Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I never thought I'd become someone who specializes in what can't be seen. Growing up in rural Maine with my grandmother, who practiced folk remedies and prayers for the townsfolk, I figured I'd end up teaching at the local school or working at the general store, like most people around here. Life, however, has its own mysterious ways of leading us down unexpected paths. My name is Alina, though folks around Blackwood Hills just call me Miss Ellie. I live in one of those old Victorian houses on Maple Street, the one with the wraparound porch and weather-beaten blue shutters. For over 20 years, I worked as a receptionist at Dr. Thornton's medical practice, where I witnessed firsthand how many people struggled with ailments that medicine couldn't explain or fix. That's when I started offering what my grandmother had taught me: herbal remedies, prayers, and spiritual comfort. I don't like calling myself a psychic or a medium. I prefer to think of myself as a woman of faith, trying to help those who ask for my assistance. The morning Sarah came looking for me, I was on my porch talking with my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of autumn day when fog clings to the ground and the air feels thick with dampness. The town seemed wrapped in a perpetual twilight, even though it was nearly 10 in the morning. "Miss Ellie, are you the one who does those prayers to ward off bad luck and ease troubled minds?" I turned to find a woman in her early 30s, wearing a gray wool coat that seemed a size too big. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her skin pale with dark circles under her eyes that highlighted the exhaustion etched across her face. "That would be me, dear. And you are Sarah. Sarah Wilson. Could you help me? It's urgent." The urgency in Sarah's voice caught me off guard. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if fearing something hidden in the morning mist. I said goodbye to Mrs. Jenkins and invited Sarah inside, leading her to my sitting room, where I usually receive people seeking help. It's a cozy space with a love seat, my grandmother's rocking chair, and a small table where I keep my tarot cards, dried herbs, and objects I use in prayers. Crosses, saint medallions, prayer beads, and various candles of different sizes. Sarah sat down, but clutched her purse against her chest like a shield. "I haven't slept properly in days. I'm being disturbed by something I can't explain. I feel watched, cursed." She looked at the floor before continuing, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It all started about 3 months ago when my husband, Mark, began acting strange. He worked in it from home, but suddenly he got a job offer in California. Everything happened so quickly, almost without my input. He moved away about a month ago, left our house behind. We barely speak now, and since then, things have gotten even worse." Her voice trembled as she spoke about him. I sensed there was a bigger problem behind his departure. "These past few days, my life has turned into a nightmare. I feel weak, everything goes wrong. I crashed my car, lost my phone. Things keep breaking in my house. And worse than that, I feel like there's something in my bedroom at night. I wake up and swear I see a shadow in the corner. It might sound crazy, but the fear paralyzes me. As Sarah spoke, I observed her demeanor. That expression of someone living on the edge, almost without the strength to continue, touched me deeply. I've always been good at perceiving energies, something I inherited from my grandmother. And Sarah emanated a dark aura mixed with a feeling of profound sadness that seemed to spring from wounds of the soul. Have you sought medical help, therapy, or something similar? I went to the emergency room twice. They ran quick tests and gave me sedatives, but it doesn't help. The feeling of oppression continues. The bad luck doesn't stop. The worst are the nights. I can't take it anymore. I handed her a glass of water, which she drank in one gulp. I sensed she simply needed to be heard. I can try to help you, but first, tell me, do you have any religious tradition or anyone in your family who works with prayers or folk remedies? She shook her head. My mother would say prayers occasionally, light candles for Saint Anthony and the Virgin Mary. Nothing intense. I grew up saying the Lord's Prayer before bed, but I never got involved with rituals. Sometimes we can open doors without realizing it. It might not be your case, but there are forces that feed on our despair. When we're very fragile, it's easier for something harmful to settle into our lives. She lowered her head. I just want my life back. I moved closer and placed my hand over hers. Let's take this slowly. First, I'll try to identify if there's any negative energy. I have a pendulum I use to test the environment, to see how it vibrates. Would you be okay starting with that? She agreed, and I stood up, going to the small table to retrieve a crystal pendulum hanging from the drawer pull. It was still the same one that had belonged to my grandmother. I'll need you to hold the pendulum for a moment. Concentrate on what's troubling you. Sarah sat in silence, eyes closed, holding the pendulum. I observed the crystal swinging from side to side. A slight tremor ran through my arm, and I felt a chill down my spine, but tried to remain steady. It wasn't definitive, but I perceived that there was indeed a strange energy surrounding Sarah. It feels heavy, Miss Ellie, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I feel something dense, as if it were stuck to me. Yes, it's like a shadow following you, I replied. Sarah began to cry softly. In many cases, people cry because they feel understood when they hear confirmation that it's not all in their heads. I handed her a tissue and waited for her to catch her breath. I'll need to visit your house, if you'll allow it. Sometimes the environment holds traces of what's happening. Sarah gave me a look of relief. I was hoping you'd say that. I don't know what else to do. I feel like that house is suffocating me. I went there the following afternoon, Wednesday around 3 o'clock, with a bag full of herbs, a spray bottle with rue and rosemary water, 7-day candles, and a small vial of holy water. The neighborhood where Sarah lived was about a 45-minute drive from mine, in one of those new subdivisions that had sprung up during the housing boom of the early 2000s. Hers was number 15 on Willow Way, and it looked deserted. The gate creaked when I pushed it, and a feeling of abandonment hit me full force. Sarah greeted me with a tight hug, thanking me repeatedly for agreeing to come. The house seems darker every day. It's like there's not enough light even when all the lamps are on, she said, her voice muffled as if the air inside was denser. I entered and immediately noticed the smell of mildew. The windows were closed, and the living room was filled with dark furniture that appeared neglected. There were signs of water damage on the walls and dark stains on the ceiling. Sarah led me to the kitchen, where a leaky faucet dripped into a bucket. I was disturbed by the heavy atmosphere that hung in the air. The entire place conveyed the sensation that something fundamental was missing, as if the house itself were depressed. My husband used to take care of these repairs. Now everything's at a standstill. I barely have the strength to deal with it, Sarah explained, fidgeting with a dish towel in her hands. I took a deep breath, mentally asking for protection. I took my pendulum from my pocket and walked through the house. I'm just going to sense the energies in each room. Will you accompany me? Yes, she agreed, though I noticed the fear on her face. The living room, hallway, and kitchen were impregnated with strong anguish. But it was upon entering the master bedroom that I felt something different, almost palpable. The air seemed colder, and for a moment I felt dizzy. I leaned against the wall to keep my balance. Sarah noticed and rushed to help me. "Oh my God, are you okay?" I'm fine. Just a sudden weakness. I looked around, forcing myself to stay calm. The bed was completely unmade, with crumpled sheets, as if someone had woken up that morning after a nightmare. On the walls, no pictures, no family photos. Everything was bare, empty, lifeless. I took the spray bottle with rue water and sprayed the corners of the room, praying softly. Sarah watched me, hugging herself as if feeling very cold. "Is this the room where you usually see that shadow?" "Almost every night. It appears in that corner near the closet. It stays motionless. I try to scream, but I can't. I'm paralyzed." I ran my hand carefully over that corner of the wall, as if trying to capture something invisible. I felt a kind of tightness in my chest, but nothing I could call supernatural out loud. Perhaps it was just Sarah's oppression transferring to me. I finished spraying the rue water and returned to the living room. I needed to recompose myself. I still don't know what it is. It could be negative energy that has taken form in your mind, or it could be something that's actually interfering with your space. Let's try a simple cleansing now, and then continue during the week. Sarah nodded, remaining silent as I lit white candles and spread holy water on the doors. I recited prayers I'd learned from my grandmother, and others I'd collected over the years. I asked for protection from Saint Michael, Saint Christopher, and spoke Bible verses that came to memory. The goal was to awaken the house, bring light and clarity to the environment, however subtle. After about 30 minutes, we stopped to rest. Night was already announcing itself, and Sarah confessed she was afraid to stay there alone. "I can stay a little longer, but I can't sleep here tonight." She picked up her phone, thought about calling a friend, but ultimately chose not to bother anyone. "Maybe I'll face this better if I'm alone." I didn't want to insist. I recommended that she leave a candle lit in a safe place in the living room and keep the hallway window open for air circulation. I told her I would return the following Monday evening to continue the cleansing work and prayers. Before leaving, Sarah looked at me with eyes that almost begged me not to abandon her. "Don't worry, I'll be back. Call me if anything happens." She walked me to the gate, looking at the empty street. A neighbor passed quickly, waved mechanically, and continued hurriedly. Then I made my way back home with my head full of thoughts and a heavy heart. That Wednesday night, I could barely close my eyes. I kept thinking about Sarah, that cold room, the shadow she claimed to see. I'd experienced many strange things, but rarely had I seen someone so consumed by fear. I decided to get up early on Thursday to seek answers. I opened my old books, reread my grandmother's notes, and called an old colleague, Diana, who studied spiritual energies in the tradition of spiritualism. I told her about the case, without exposing details of Sarah's identity. "Diana, do you think it could be some obsessive spirit that's settled in the house?" She spoke calmly. "It could be, but sometimes it's just the person generating a thought form. Despair feeds on itself." I thanked her for the suggestion, although I didn't feel any lighter. I needed to see Sarah again and observe if the situation had improved or worsened. The days dragged slowly. I didn't receive any call from Sarah, but my chest maintained that uneasiness. Finally, Monday arrived. I went to her house around 4 o'clock. I rang the doorbell 3 times with no response. I tried to push the gate, but it was locked. I called her name, looking through the gap in the fence. Shortly after, she appeared at the door with a pale face and a look of pure panic. "I thought you wouldn't come back," she said, opening the gate for me. "You didn't answer the doorbell." "I was worried. I'm sorry. I haven't been sleeping. I'm very confused. I thought it was a hallucination." We entered, and I immediately noticed that the house was a mess. Several dirty glasses in the sink, a strong smell of leftover food in the air. Sarah led me to the living room, stumbling over a crumpled rug. "When was the last time you left the house?" I asked. "I don't remember. It must have been about 4 days ago. Sorry about the mess. I don't have the energy even to wash the dishes." I put my hand on her back, trying to show support. Her body was trembling slightly, as if she had a fever. "Did you feel any improvement with the prayers and cleansing we did on Wednesday?" Sarah shook her head from side to side, eyes welling up. "No, I feel like everything got even heavier. The candle light went out by itself. One night I heard knocks on the wall. When I went to check, nothing was there." She looked up as if seeing something on the ceiling. "And the shadow continues. I freeze in shock, paralyzed. It's horrible." I felt a chill. This required stronger actions. I opened my bag with herbs, candles, and crosses that I'd brought and laid everything on the center table of the living room. "I'll try a deeper cleansing. It's important that you accompany me. Let's pray together and remember, stay calm. Don't give in to panic." Sarah seemed unsure but agreed. Together, we began to walk through the house. I used incense of rosemary and rue that I'd learned to prepare, and the smoke spread through the rooms as I asked for protection from Saint Michael the Archangel, repeating mentally, "Deliver us from all evil, Amen." Sarah followed, albeit with a trembling voice. Each room deserved special care. In the living room, I left a candle lit on a white saucer, asking for light to dispel any evil influence. In the kitchen, I used coarse salt in the corners, something my grandmother always recommended. Everything flowed until we reached the bedroom again. The sensation as soon as I crossed the threshold was like receiving a shock to the chest. My heart accelerated, and my right leg seemed to weaken. Sarah grabbed my arm. "It's here. This part is the worst." The bedroom was dimly lit because the blind on the window was partially lowered. Weak, almost gray light gave the environment a desolate appearance. It seemed that the entire house concentrated its sadness there. Suddenly, I heard a crack, as if something had fallen behind us. I turned quickly, but saw nothing beyond the shadows of the walls. Sarah was gasping, holding my arm tightly. "Stay calm," I said, trying to maintain serenity in my voice. "Keep praying and don't let go of my hand." I sprayed the rue water around while repeating protection prayers. The Lord's Prayer, Hail Mary, Saint Michael the Archangel. My head was throbbing, and with each word I spoke, I felt a weight on my shoulders as if carrying a sack of invisible stones. I closed my eyes, seeking concentration, but heard Sarah's weak whisper, it's there in the corner again." I looked in that direction. I couldn't see something completely defined, but I distinguished a darker patch than the rest of the environment, a motionless blur. My heart raced. It could have been just my mind playing tricks on me, the low light, the nervousness. But I felt an almost palpable presence. I squeezed Sarah's hand and concentrated my mind on a prayer without opening my eyes. I tried to channel all the faith and will to dispel that thing. However, a chill ran down my spine and nausea took over my stomach. It seemed that the air was thinning, making each breath difficult. It was as if the walls were closing in around me. The sensation lasted a few seconds, but seemed like an eternity. When I opened my eyes, the corner of the room was empty, just the furniture leaning against the dark wall. Sarah was trembling so much she could barely stand. I saw it," she stammered, without letting go of my arm. "I'm sure there was something there." I didn't want to discredit her vision, but I also couldn't affirm that I'd seen the same thing. I touched the rosary hanging around my neck. It might be a spirit trapped in this place, or some energy feeding on your anguish. "Let's go out to the living room for a bit, get some air. We need to calm down to continue." We returned to the living room and sat down. Sarah was trembling, hugging her knees. I handed her a thin blanket I found on the sofa. I remained quiet for a few minutes, trying to digest what I had felt. I've always been open to the unexplainable, but I confess that my natural skepticism made me question if we weren't just too suggestible. However, the fear was real and was stamped on Sarah's face. "I'm going to call my colleague," I said, feeling my throat dry. "She understands mediumship and can help us better understand what's happening. Perhaps we'll do a group prayer. It might help renew the energies in the house." Sarah nodded, breathing with difficulty. "Miss Ellie, just don't abandon me, please. I feel like this thing wants to destroy me. Don't worry, we'll see this through to the end." I said goodbye later that evening. I was physically and mentally exhausted. Before leaving, I left 3 candles lit around the house, all in safe containers. I asked Sarah to read a psalm from the Bible before sleeping. She promised she would try. For the next day, I arranged with my friend Diana to come together on Saturday, which would be 2 days away, for a collective prayer session. Friday passed in an agitated manner. I had to work until mid-afternoon at the clinic and only got home after 6. I checked my phone and noticed 2 missed calls from Sarah. I called back, but no one answered. I tried 2 more times without success and felt a knot in my heart. Something told me she wasn't well. Saturday arrived, and Diana came to pick me up at my building around 2 in the afternoon. We took a cab toward Sarah's house. The driver, a friendly gentleman, dropped us off at the address. I paid, and we stood there in front of the house, with the feeling that something bad had happened. The gate was ajar, the living room door half open. We called Sarah's name, but no sign of life. I looked at Diana apprehensively. "Let's go in, but carefully," I said, feeling my stomach turn. I pushed the rusty gate, which let out a high-pitched creak, and proceeded to the door. The house was dark, the smell of mildew even stronger. I took a few steps into the living room, noticing a broken glass on the floor, shards scattered across the carpet. No sound of footsteps. "Sarah," I called, my voice echoing down the hallway. No response. Diana held my hand, and we went together to the bedroom. I pushed the door carefully, but saw nothing beyond the same empty walls. The bed even more disheveled, and on the nightstand, a candle melted to the end. It seemed like the house had been abandoned in haste. It was then that I noticed Sarah's purse thrown in a corner, next to the closet. I grabbed it desperately. Inside was her wallet with documents, money, everything intact. "Miss Ellie, look at this," called Diana from back in the living room. She was holding a phone that appeared to be out of battery. It was under the sofa. We felt a chill. Had Sarah left without her purse, without her phone? Diana said we could try calling a contact, but with no battery, that was impossible. I tried to think amid the anxiety. I looked around, hoping to find a note or sign that Sarah had left of her own free will. But the house was in total disarray, as if someone had struggled there. I was paralyzed for a few moments, not knowing what to do. A premonition told me something terrible had occurred during the night. I took Diana's phone to call the police, but before I could dial, we heard voices in the street. We rushed to the door of the house. Two neighbors were in front, looking tense. One of them approached. "Are you friends of Sarah's?" "Yes, we're friends." "Do you know anything?" I asked anxiously. "There was a tragedy last night. It seems the ambulance. She was taken in critical condition. There was some kind of episode. I don't know exactly. They say she was delirious, screaming, hitting her head against the wall. When they tried to restrain her, she was already covered in blood. I heard she didn't make it to the hospital." My heart stopped. I felt a chill down my spine, and my legs trembled so much that Diana had to hold me up. "My God, are you sure about this?" The man, a gray-haired gentleman, nodded his head, visibly shaken. "I heard she died in the ambulance. By the time they reached the hospital, it was too late." I was overcome by devastating sadness. I felt the bitter taste of guilt in my throat for not having been there when Sarah needed me most. Diana was also at a loss for words. We thanked the neighbors and went back inside the house, which now seemed like an empty tomb. The silence was heavy. "Alina, I couldn't have imagined this would happen," said Diana, hugging me. I pulled away with eyes full of tears. I couldn't contain the crying. "She called me yesterday. I didn't answer in time. I was stuck at work and now she's..." My voice broke and the tears flowed freely. We stayed there for a few minutes, thinking about what to do. The only certainty I had was that the house exuded a feeling of helplessness, as if the darkness impregnated in the walls laughed at our pain. Perhaps there wasn't any entity at all, just Sarah's loneliness and imbalance that culminated in a tragedy. Or maybe there really was a dark force fed by her suffering. At that moment, nothing mattered beyond the fact that we had lost a precious life, and her anguish had no solution. I took one last look at the deserted living room. I remembered when I arrived days ago and saw her so fragile, begging for help. A revolt grew inside me, mixed with a feeling of failure. "Let's go, Diana. There's nothing more we can do here." I left behind the candles, the coarse salt, and the prayers I had worked so hard to bring. I got into the cab back home, still somewhat dazed, silently praying that Sarah had finally found peace somewhere. Since then, I've never passed in front of that house again. They say it remains empty, the windows closed, the gate locked with a padlock. What happened to Sarah remains a haunting memory, a painful lesson that there are things beyond our control. I continue helping people who seek me out, but now I have even more respect for the thin line that separates what is visible from what is not. And on sleepless nights, I find myself looking at the corner of my bedroom, afraid of seeing a shadow, as if Sarah's story were somehow still accompanying me, reminding me that the greatest darkness often dwells in the labyrinths of our own mind, or in something beyond it. Thank you for listening to my story. Make sure to hit the notification bell to be alerted of all future narratives. I post new videos daily. Hope to see you next time. I'll leave 2 other good videos on screen that I know you'll enjoy. See you there. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I spent most of my life surrounded by the chaos of Chicago, the relentless pace, the crowded streets, and the constant commotion were exactly what I thought suited me. But everything changed after an accident I prefer not to detail. My tolerance for noise simply vanished. Each sound, no matter how small, became unbearable. The neurologist diagnosed me with a rare case of hyperacusis, a condition where everyday sounds trigger extreme reactions of stress and anxiety. Imagine that uncomfortable tingling sensation when a limb falls asleep. Now imagine that feeling in your chest constantly. It was as if my body remained on high alert, waiting for a danger that never arrived. Any sudden noise, a distant car horn or a door slamming, shot through my nerves like an electric current. Living like this was impossible. 5 years ago, I found a refuge, a secluded cabin lost among the mountains of northern New Hampshire. I won't specify the exact location, but I'll just say it sits in some remote corner near the White Mountains. The place seemed ideal, few neighbors, non-existent traffic, and cell reception so weak it was barely useful. But what truly convinced me was the absolute silence. For the first time in years, I had hope of finding peace. The construction was modest but welcoming. The online listing didn't lie, built with sturdy timber, and featuring a stone fireplace that seemed capable of withstanding any winter. The cabin exuded an aroma that mixed pine and the yellowed pages of old books, a smell of comfort like an inn lost in time. Anyone who's ever stayed in a mountain chalet would know exactly what I'm talking about. My closest neighbor lived about 15 minutes walk along a narrow trail, but I didn't see them during my first week. I preferred to simply enjoy the silence. I woke to birdsong without sirens or horns yanking me from sleep. And at night, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the trees. The world seemed suspended, finally allowing me to breathe. As I worked remotely, my only connection to civilization was my laptop, and that was enough for me. After about 10 days, a knock at the door interrupted my routine. The cabin didn't have a doorbell, so I quickly became accustomed to visitors announcing themselves this way. When I opened the door, I found a woman holding a basket. It was Alina, my neighbor, exactly as I'd imagined, or almost. She appeared to be in her 70s, with long silver hair and intense green eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She carried a serious expression, direct and straightforward. With a firm gesture, she extended the basket in my direction, expecting me to take it. There was no choice. She practically shoved it in my face. A gesture of courtesy, perhaps, but something about it struck me as strange. I took the basket, thanked her, and noticed she didn't avert her gaze. She was waiting for me to say something more, but I couldn't find the words. I just smiled. She remained there, motionless, her posture rigid like someone unaccustomed to social interactions. Then, without any change in expression, she finally broke the silence and uttered a phrase that still echoes in my mind today. Always keep your lanterns full, your windows tightly sealed, and your mind sharper than your axe. Those words didn't seem like something you'd say in casual conversation. Her tone was impersonal, almost mechanical, as if reciting guidelines from some forgotten manual. To me, it sounded much more like a warning than simple advice. I just nodded, forced a smile, and closed the door. I stood there listening. I expected her footsteps to quickly disappear down the trail, but she remained motionless for about 45 seconds before walking away. Perhaps that was the most unsettling detail of all. Still, I tried not to think much about it. That gesture, as strange as it was, still seemed like an act of kindness. Alina didn't appear threatening, just someone accustomed to living alone. If I needed help, I felt she would extend a hand, but without getting too involved. Knowing there was someone nearby, even though I had no plans to depend on her, brought a certain comfort. I left the basket in the living room, without even looking at what was inside, and continued my routine. Later, a snowstorm descended upon the forest. Heavy snowfall wasn't uncommon in that region, but this was unusually fierce. With the power fluctuating with each gust of wind, I lit several candles and huddled on the sofa with a book, trying to ignore the moments when the lights flickered. For many, this might have been a frightening scenario, but for me, it was almost comforting. I realized my brain didn't react to the sounds of nature the same way it reacted to urban noises. The sound of heavy snow hitting the roof, the wind whistling through the trees, all of this had an unexpectedly calming effect. But as always, this tranquility didn't last long. Hours later, a thunderous blow to the door made me jump. It wasn't a normal knock. The dry impact echoed throughout the cabin, loud enough to cut through the noise of the storm. Whoever was on the other side didn't care about the blizzard. My chest tightened with that familiar tingling sensation. I held my breath for a few seconds before grabbing a flashlight and walking to the entrance. Through the glass panel beside the door, I saw Alina. She was completely covered in snow, holding a lantern firmly. Before I could ask anything, she launched into an explanation. She had seen someone lurking around my woodpile and thought I needed to know. My thoughts jumbled for a moment, but the information itself was concerning enough that I didn't immediately question it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, sweeping the darkness with the beam of light. All I saw were trees swaying under the storm. I asked if she was sure about what she'd seen. Alina nodded, keeping her eyes fixed on the forest, as if expecting something or someone to emerge at any moment. Her gaze was tense, focused. The whole scene felt wrong. I continued looking for signs of movement, but there was nothing beyond the natural chaos of the snowy night. Before I could press the matter, Alina simply muttered for me to be careful and turned to leave. She didn't wait for a response, didn't give me time for more questions. She just disappeared down the trail back to her cabin, the light from her lantern wavering until it vanished completely. I stood there for a few more moments, trying to understand what had just happened. As soon as I closed the door, something inside me reconfigured. Her story didn't make sense. How exactly could she have seen someone at my woodpile if her house was 15 minutes away? To see something so specific, she would already have had to be on my property. But why? And stranger still, what would make her come out in the middle of that blizzard just to tell me this? If she was lying, what would be the reason? None of it fit together. But standing there, doing nothing, didn't seem like an option either. I locked every window and every door as carefully as I could, and took refuge in my bedroom, waiting and listening. The snowfall gradually lost its strength, diminishing in intensity, but the tension inside me only increased. The hours dragged on without anything relevant happening, so I imagined it might be safe to fall asleep. I'm not sure exactly what time it was, but at some point after midnight, I was awakened by a sharp sound coming from outside, like a dry branch snapping. My hearing has always been acute for this sort of thing, so I was certain it was that and not something else. I remained motionless for a few moments, paying attention. Gradually, I rose and, taking every precaution, walked to the window, hoping to find nothing there. At first, I saw nothing different, but then I noticed Alina standing at the edge of the forest, her back to my house. The long, disheveled hair left no doubt. I tried to see better, but the only illumination was the weak light of the moon. When I saw her begin to turn in my direction, I quickly ducked down to avoid being seen. I stayed that way for what seemed like an eternity, until I gathered the courage to take another look, but she had already disappeared. I didn't know how to react. I had never considered her a threat, just eccentric. But from that moment on, I began to see her differently. Why would she have warned me about something, and then prowled around the forest that way? It made no sense. I lay there, restless, unable to close my eyes for a long time. I almost gave up on sleep entirely, but eventually relaxed. And it was precisely when I was about to doze off that I heard a knock at the door. This time it was different. The sound wasn't loud or desperate, but it still put me on maximum alert. No matter what it was, I wasn't going to open it. With my chest tight and the hair on the back of my neck standing on end, I slowly approached the door and peered through the glass, trying not to be noticed. Fear hit me in an overwhelming wave. Outside wasn't Alina. There was a large man, bald with a thick beard. I swallowed a scream in my throat and forced myself not to react. What before was merely strange had now become a genuine nightmare. I did what I could to retreat without drawing attention, locked myself in the bathroom, and with trembling hands dialed the police. While I explained the situation, the knocking began to grow stronger, as if he were trying to break down the entrance. The dispatcher asked me not to hang up, assuring me that help was on the way, but I didn't know if there was time. Fear paralyzed me. Suddenly a crash. The door was broken down. The sound of splintering wood echoed throughout the cabin, followed by the noise of objects being destroyed, glasses breaking, furniture being thrown. My breathing was shallow. Any sound could give me away. By luck, or for some reason I never understood, he didn't come looking for me. I didn't hear footsteps approaching the hallway, just chaos being spread through the living room. Then silence. My chest rose and fell uncontrollably, fighting against panic. The police arrived faster than I expected, but it was already too late. The intruder had vanished. I poured out a torrent of questions to the officers, begging for some concrete action, but it was no use. They searched the area superficially, and nothing beyond that. They refused to enter the forest, claiming the woods were too dense for an efficient search. I insisted they accompany me to Aliner's cabin. Reluctantly, they agreed. When we arrived, a chill ran up my spine. The cabin was empty, with a disturbing air of abandonment. The officers said that according to local records, no one had lived there for over 30 years. But something didn't make sense. The cabin wasn't completely deteriorated. It didn't look like a structure forgotten by time. I asked them to check for signs of intrusion, but they said there was no evidence of recent movement, no footprints in the fresh snow, no objects out of place. It was as if Aliner had never existed. The shock was followed by outrage. Their response was cold. Choosing to live isolated in the middle of the wilderness meant dealing with this sort of thing. After that, they simply left. I knew she existed. I spoke with her, I saw her eyes. Of course, I didn't waste time and left too, but I had to spend one more night in my cabin. It was a terrible experience. Every sound seemed like a threat, but somehow I made it through one more dawn without incident. Since then, my life has moved forward, better than before. But that episode still occupies my mind frequently. Some of my more superstitious friends have raised a curious theory. What if Aliner was some kind of spirit trying to protect me? Maybe she was there to watch over the property, for reasons we would never understand. But I'm not the type who believes in supernatural things. To me, the most plausible explanation is that there were two people, Aliner and that man, living illegally in the cabin. What never made sense, however, is why she would have alerted me to a danger if shortly after she seemed to be threatening me herself. That's a detail I may never understand. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a like. It's very important. Well, let's continue. My name is Bowden. I met my girlfriend Sophia 5 years ago when we both enrolled at Lviv National University, one of the most prestigious universities in Ukraine. It was a place I had dreamed of attending since I was 12 years old. Neither of us was born in Lviv. On the contrary, we came from eastern Ukraine. She's from Kharkiv, and I grew up in a small town near Dnipro. Perhaps that's what brought us together right from the start. as most of the university students were locals, and our Eastern origins made us feel somewhat out of place. We created a tradition of splitting holidays between our families. Sophia is practically part of my family now, so her presence at celebrations is not only expected, but essential. Since her home is about 5 hours away from mine, we developed a special ritual. We spend Christmas Eve with my family, who celebrate on January 6th in the evening, and then drive to her house to make it in time for Christmas dinner on the 7th. Before meeting her, I wasn't even aware that many people in Ukraine celebrate Christmas according to different calendars, some on January 6th and 7th, others on December 24th and 25th. Interestingly, my favorite part of this season isn't even the festive dinner or the gifts, but the journey we take during the night. It has become our special ritual that we eagerly anticipate all year long. The first such trip still remains one of my most vivid memories. Due to where I live, the fastest route to her home doesn't go through main highways, but through quieter roads surrounded by fields, snow-covered trees, and scattered ancient estates in the distance. Since we travel late at night, we rarely encounter other vehicles. There's a feeling that the entire world is asleep, and only the two of us remain vigilant, masters of the road. Don't laugh, but during the trip, we always listen to KALUSH, a Ukrainian group known for their emotional tracks with folk and rap elements. Since we met, their music has become part of our routine. I know not everyone appreciates them, but singing together in the car in perfect harmony has something special about it. Last Christmas, everything started as usual. After a pleasant evening with my family, we packed up around 1 a.m. and hit the road. Light snow was falling, and the streets were deserted exactly as we had imagined. With the heater on and music playing loudly, the moment seemed perfect, until suddenly everything changed. What happened next was one of the most eerie experiences of my life. I was driving when the music was interrupted by my phone ringing. I frowned. Who would be calling at this hour? On the screen, an unknown number. I ignored the call, thinking it was probably some scammer. Such calls had become increasingly frequent lately. Sophia laughed and remarked that these telemarketers must be truly dedicated to their job to call in the middle of Christmas. I smiled, waved it off, and turned up the music volume. A few minutes later, the phone rang again, the same unknown number. I sighed and let the call go to voicemail. Sophia gave me a slightly uncertain look, but didn't say anything. I raised the phone so she could see and shrugged as if to say, again. Strange, was all she replied. We returned to listening to music, but of course, it wasn't long before the phone rang for the third time. This time I was furious. It felt like someone was stalking me. I grabbed the device, ready to ask them to stop bothering me. I noticed Sophia shrinking in the seat next to me, surprised by my sudden movement. I admit I overreacted a bit, but I was tired and irritated. Hello, my voice came out louder than I expected, filled with irritation. I was ready to hear some generic scam recording, but from the other end of the line came only silence, interrupted by a low hissing. I was about to hang up when suddenly a male voice spoke. Hello, Bowden. My hands almost released the steering wheel. A chill ran down my spine, leaving my entire body on alert. Before I could react, the man continued. He began listing personal information about me, my full name, my address, intimate details of my life that no stranger should have access to. My brain seemed to freeze, working automatically while I was still driving. I wanted to scream, but swallowed the panic. Screaming wouldn't solve anything. After a few seconds of suffocating silence, I summoned the courage to ask what he wanted, trying to keep my voice steady. He paused and answered something that made my blood run cold. He said he wasn't interested in me, but in Sophia. The moment I heard her name, the fear multiplied. I glanced to the side and saw on Sophia's face that she felt the same. I stammered that I didn't know any Sophia, trying to get out of the situation, but he laughed. "She's sitting right there, next to you." That was enough for me to lose any trace of calm. I pulled over to the side of the road with trembling hands. My mind was spinning, full of questions. But before I could say anything, Sophia leaned over and pressed the button to end the call. Everything happened in a second. "Why did you hang up on a stranger who's threatening us?" I shouted furiously. She didn't respond immediately. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with a fear that mirrored my own. I took the phone and tried to call back once, twice, 3 times. No call went through. "Let's go, please." Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I swallowed and started driving again, but I couldn't just leave it at that. I kept insisting, asking why she hung up, what she thought it meant. Sophia only said that she was scared, that she couldn't be blamed for acting on impulse. I understood, but at the same time, my head was boiling with another possibility. What if she was hiding something? It wouldn't be the first time. We had already had arguments because of small lies. What if this was something bigger than it seemed? The rest of the journey continued in suffocating silence. No music, no conversation, just my thoughts circling, trying to understand how someone could know exactly where we would be that night. When we finally arrived at her house, I felt no relief. It's been almost 2 months now, and answers are still absent. We asked our families if anyone could be involved, but nobody knew anything. Sophia insists she's just as baffled as I am, which only strengthens my certainty that that call wasn't an innocent prank. It may seem like an exaggeration, but I'm sure it was something much bigger than a simple prank. Besides our families, nobody knew about our journey. Since that night, every time my phone rings, my heart speeds up. I wait, counting the days until he calls again, and deep down, I feel it's not a question of if, but when. And the scariest part, now during our night drives in the car, I notice distant headlights appearing and disappearing on the road behind us. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe someone is following us. And I don't know if we'll ever find out who it is and what they really want. Perhaps all of us have experienced moving at some point in our lives. Renting a new house carries with it the hope for a fresh start. But what if instead of tranquility, you find something waiting for you? Something that will never leave. If you decide to stay with me tonight, I'll tell you what happened within those cold walls. My name is Sarah, and this is my story. The winter of 2010 in New England was particularly harsh. My husband David had secured a position at the local college, and we moved to a small town in Massachusetts. One of those ancient settlements where every house has its own history. From the moment we stepped over the threshold of that Victorian house, I felt something unusual. Not fear, just an odd sensation that wouldn't leave me. For David and our children, it was the perfect place. Conveniently located near the college and school, with an excellent price for a house of that size. We knew about this town, although we rarely visited that street. We had heard some things a few years ago. The house belonged to a family who met a tragic fate. I won't go into details, but they were involved in dark affairs. Relatives of the previous owners inherited the property and quickly decided to rent it out. It seemed that nobody wanted to live there because of what had happened. But when we saw how much the price had dropped, we decided to take advantage of the opportunity. The first day passed without problems. The house was in good condition, although it had a gloomy appearance, perhaps due to the antique furniture left by the previous owners. Nothing unusual happened, except for the suffocating silence when everyone went to bed. By the second night, everything changed. David and I were lying in bed when we heard noise in the kitchen. It was almost 11 o'clock at night, and the sound was clear, as if someone was moving chairs at the dining table. I got up, thinking that one of the children had woken up and gone to get water, but there was no one in the kitchen. Everything was in its place. Chairs, glasses, nothing disturbed the usual order. David also came to look, but we found no explanation. Probably some noise from the neighbors, he suggested. That calmed me for a moment. Perhaps it really was just a sound from outside. On the third night, the situation became even more disturbing. My older son Ethan, who was 19, got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom on the lower floor. The next morning at breakfast, he told us what had happened. When I was approaching the bathroom door, I saw something. A shadow flashed past the window. At first, I thought it was one of you, but when I asked if anyone was there, I received no answer. He opened the door slowly, hesitating. No one. The space was empty, but he swore he had seen someone. Silence fell at the table. David tried to reassure him, saying it was probably his imagination, that he was sleepy and mistaken. Ethan didn't argue, but the expression on his face spoke for itself. He was terrified. Days passed, and the strange events intensified. At night, we heard noises in the kitchen, as if plates were being smashed on the floor and chairs pushed forcefully. Sometimes, while watching TV in the bedroom, we saw a shadow passing through the corridor through the gap under the door, accompanied by hurried footsteps. But when we checked, there was never anyone there. However, what really began to worry me was related to my younger daughter Emily, who was 6 years old. One morning at breakfast, she said something that sent chills down my spine. Last night I talked to my friend. What friend? I asked. The girl who lives in my room, she replied without hesitation. David and I exchanged looks filled with horror. My heart was pounding wildly when I asked Emily what this friend looked like. With complete naturalness, she described a girl with long hair who told her that her family had also lived here. She spoke without fear, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. After that, I began to notice that Emily was talking to herself in her room. She laughed, whispered, as if she were not alone. The most disturbing detail was that the previous family also had a daughter of the same age as mine. From that time on, staying in that house alone became unbearable for me. One morning, while cleaning the house, shivers ran down my spine. I was absent-mindedly sweeping when, from the corner of my eye, I noticed someone crossing the living room toward the dining table. My body froze. It was a thin woman with short hair, dressed in a black robe, walking barefoot. Her gaze was fixed on some invisible point, as if she didn't notice me. I held my breath. I knew exactly who it was, the previous owner of the house. I blinked and she disappeared. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination, that I was just impressed. But nothing could compare to what happened that Friday. Ethan stayed up late, finishing work for college. At around 3 in the morning, he went downstairs for water. A piercing scream tore through the silence of the house. David and I ran out and found our son on the floor, pale and trembling. I saw. He was here, was all he could repeat in a trembling voice. David leaned down and asked, "Who, son?" Ethan pointed to the dark corner of the living room. He tried to explain between irregular breaths. He said that coming downstairs, he heard muffled crying. A man was sitting there on the floor, hugging his knees. The sadness emanating from him was suffocating. At first, Ethan thought it was David, perhaps upset after an argument with me. But when he turned on the light, he realized that this man was not his father. He was wearing a shirt stained with something dark red. And then, without making any sudden movements, he simply dissolved into the air. We froze in absolute silence. Ethan was trembling, and no one else could deny the obvious. We were not alone in that house. That same night, David made a decision. He woke us up and said we would leave at dawn. After a long sigh, he confessed to something he had been hiding from everyone. A few weeks ago, going out to work early in the morning, he saw a girl playing in the yard. Irritated, he thought it was Emily and was about to scold her. But when he opened the door, the yard was empty. While he was speaking, Emily interrupted with her small and innocent voice. "I know who it is. It's my friend, the girl from my room." We were shocked, but what she said next was even worse. "I'm not afraid of her, but I am of her family. They're scary, they have holes in their bodies." A chill ran down our spines. That's how that family had died, in a brutal manner. No one said anything more, but David's look made it clear. We couldn't stay there. The next morning, we packed our things and went to the owners of the house. We gave no explanations. We just wanted to leave. We moved a few streets away from there, but the burden of that house never completely left us. To this day, we hear stories of new tenants who don't stay there long. And every time I pass by that house, I feel a tremor, as if an invisible gaze follows me from some window. As if that family is still there, waiting. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to be alerted of all future stories. I upload new videos every day. Hope to see you in the next ones. Some places seem to carry a strange loneliness, as if time had stopped within them. During the day, everything appears normal. But at night, when the hustle fades, and only the echo of your own footsteps remains, the feeling changes. It was in this type of place that I began working, thinking it would be just another quiet shift. But with time, I realized there was something there, something that made no sense, and that nobody could explain. Good evening, folks. My name is Jack. and I want to share an experience that left me unsettled for a long time. Maybe it was all in my head, but even today, whenever I remember it, I feel that strange shiver again. I started working as a night security guard in a partially abandoned commercial building in downtown Boston. To be honest, I never liked the graveyard shift. The building is enormous, but only a few floors were still functioning, while the rest had been abandoned for years. At first, I thought it would be a quiet job. After all, who would want to break into an essentially empty place? But within the first few days, I noticed something strange about the elevator panels. They seemed to move on their own, especially in the middle of the night. The feeling of standing down there, watching the display marking floors that shouldn't be in use, always gave me chills. Nobody was entering or exiting, and yet the elevator would go up and down, eventually opening its doors on the ground floor without a soul in sight. One of the older doormen said this was normal, that it sometimes happened due to electrical failures, but I couldn't help feeling a heaviness in the air. It seemed like every time the doors opened, something invisible was actually exiting or entering. Yet there was no record of any human presence. As the weeks passed, other situations began to make me uncomfortable. Sometimes, while monitoring the cameras, I would see strange shadows passing through corridors of empty floors. But when I went to check personally, I found nothing but hallways smelling of mildew and dust. One night in particular, I swore I saw a figure standing in front of one of the glass doors on the 14th floor. But when I got there, the place was completely deserted. The guard from the previous shift told me about weird noises coming from inside the walls, like something was moving within them. However, he also said that none of this was new, and that I would get used to it over time. The most disturbing part was that after he said this, I felt as if the entire building was watching me, almost as if it were waiting for my reaction. It was a heavy silence, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Still, I tried to maintain my professional composure, pretending it didn't affect me. Things really escalated when I started hearing a voice through my radio, always calling me by name. At first, I thought it was a coworker testing my nerves, but the voice didn't sound like anyone I knew. It called Jack slowly, almost painfully, and always in the dead of night. I asked the other security guards if someone was talking to me, but they all swore they knew nothing about it. They even laughed, saying the building must be playing tricks on me. When I told one of the older janitors about this, he just shook his head and told me that many strange things had already happened there. I didn't quite understand what he meant at that moment, but his worried look stuck in my head. I began to sleep poorly, waking up in a sweat from confusing nightmares that I couldn't quite remember at dawn. A week later, I had the unfortunate idea of personally checking the top floor, from where there were always reports of blinking lights on the cameras. The janitor had warned me that that specific floor had been locked for years because the space was deactivated, and nobody was interested in renovating it. Still, I felt a strange curiosity, almost like a calling that wouldn't leave me in peace. So after hearing that voice calling me on the radio again, I decided to go up. Arriving up there, the atmosphere was even heavier. A long, poorly lit corridor with intermittently failing lights. The air had such a strong smell of mildew that it made me nauseous. And you could see dust hanging in the air as if nobody had entered there for centuries. It was at this moment that I heard a persistent telephone ring, although I had no idea where it was coming from, since that floor shouldn't have any functioning devices. It seemed impossible, but the sound continued echoing, drawing me toward the end of the corridor. I moved toward the ringing, which seemed to echo from a room at the end of the hallway. My heart was beating so hard that all I could think about was going back to the elevator, but something compelled me to continue. When I finally reached the location, I found a dusty glass door that yielded with a light push. Inside, there was an old desk and nothing else, except for an old rotary phone ringing nonstop on top of a counter. I hesitated before approaching, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the phone, and instantly the ringing stopped. On the other end, I heard only heavy breathing, as if someone was very close to the microphone. No words came out. The person, or whatever it was, just breathed heavily with a sound uncomfortably close to my ears. That suffocating silence made me drop the phone immediately. My first impulse was to run away from there, but I still wanted to understand where that call was coming from and how a deactivated device could still function. I tried to stay calm and see if the phone had any connected cable, but everything was tangled on the wall, full of cobwebs. It didn't make any sense. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the corridor, heavy steps that sounded like old boots walking on the floor. I froze, not knowing whether to call for help on the radio or stay quiet. But when I finally gathered the courage to look through the door, there was nothing there, just a claustrophobic emptiness. Even so, I swore I had seen someone's shadow at the end of the corridor, turning the corner. I decided not to risk it. I dropped everything and got out of there as fast as I could. This experience disturbed me so much that I went to talk to the janitor again. He let out a heavy sigh and decided to tell me that years ago, a maintenance worker had died in the elevator shaft. They said at the time that it was a maintenance accident, but the circumstances never became entirely clear. The janitor commented that after that, the building was never the same. Many claimed to hear the sounds of chains dragging, doors opening by themselves, and especially the elevator moving without anyone in it. He explained to me that every company that tried to rent any floor above the 10th gave up after a short time, citing security problems and unstable power. That's how the building ended up practically abandoned. Hearing all this, a chill ran through my body. It seemed that somehow that story was repeating itself with me. After this conversation, I began to notice the elevators even more. Every time one of them arrived at the ground floor without being called, I felt a shiver run down my neck. One early morning, I checked the camera records and noticed something sinister. In several recordings, you could see the elevator door opening on random floors, and for a few seconds, a misshapen shadow would appear in the gap, as if peering into the corridor. It was impossible to determine any human form, but it was large and dark, seeming to absorb the little light in the environment. The most bizarre thing was noticing that in the recordings, precisely at the moment when the shadow appeared, the audio picked up a low, almost imperceptible static, as if someone was trying to speak but couldn't. That tied my stomach in knots and made me reconsider whether I should really continue working there. With each shift that passed, I realized I was becoming more paranoid. I even asked the maintenance technician to check the elevators, but he guaranteed that everything was working normally, saying there were no faults that would justify this random movement. Still, around 3 in the morning, I almost always heard the ding of the elevator arriving at the ground floor, opening empty doors to the solitary lobby. Sometimes I would go there to check, but I only found that silent space, as if it were provoking me to discover what was behind it all. The more I tried to find rational explanations, the more the building seemed to react. Lights flickered more frequently, doors of empty rooms slammed by themselves, and the radio continued to emit noises, whispering my name at random moments. I began to feel watched, even when I was surrounded by cameras that theoretically should give me security. Some days later, I finally met a former tenant who always talked with the janitor during the afternoon. Curious, I asked about the building's history, and he repeated the tragedy of the worker who fell into the elevator shaft, but brought even darker details. According to him, it wasn't just an accident, but a succession of negligence and internal conflicts. Rumors said that the man had been locked there to prevent him from reporting dangerous working conditions. There was never any concrete evidence, but the tenant swore that since then, the spirit of this worker wandered through the unoccupied floors without rest. He also told me that several times they tried to seal the elevator where the accident occurred, but something always made the doors open on their own, as if the building refused to keep them closed. These revelations tied my mind in knots. I started having increasingly vivid nightmares, always involving the elevator shaft and a suffocating sensation of being trapped. I would wake up gasping with the impression of having heard someone scream my name, but it was difficult to distinguish dream from reality. One early morning, I decided I needed to take action. I talked to my supervisor and made it clear that I couldn't handle that environment much longer. He laughed nervously, suggesting I take a few days off if I was so shaken up. But I didn't want more days off. What I really wanted was to get out of there. I was determined to quit and look for another job. Any job that didn't involve walking alone through abandoned corridors in the middle of the night. However, before formally leaving, I went to check the latest night footage to fill out the usual report. That's when I got the biggest shock of my entire life. In every scene where I appeared entering the elevator, there was a strange dark form reflected in the mirror, as if it had been by my side the whole time, just observing me. You couldn't see a face or defined outline, but it was clearly a presence next to me, motionless, as if silently staring at me. I reviewed the recordings repeatedly, trying to find a logical explanation. Light failure, reflection, interference, but nothing made sense. That thing was simply there, appearing and disappearing the instant the doors closed, leaving me with the impression that I wasn't alone at any moment. At this point, I had confirmation that something truly supernatural was attached to me, or at least to the elevator. I could no longer think straight. Every noise made me jump out of my chair, and every time the radio crackled, I felt my heart almost stop. Even so, I had to face the rest of the shift, because I couldn't simply drop everything and leave without notice. The night dragged on in a torturous way. I felt like I was being watched the entire time, and the worst part was that the building seemed to breathe, emitting clicking and creaking sounds more intensely. When there was little time left before the end of the shift, I gathered courage and went up again, this time to the floor where the recordings were kept, determined to collect the tapes as proof that I wasn't crazy. It was at this hour that I heard, for the last time, that telephone ringing, echoing through the dark corridor. My mind locked up. It didn't make sense for the phone to be ringing again on that abandoned floor, but I knew it was the same room. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was almost hypnotic, each ring resonating inside me. Then, against my will, I began walking in the direction from where I believed the noise was coming. At the end of the corridor, the door was ajar, letting a weak light escape. I entered with my heart in my mouth, and once again found that telephone on top of the desk. But this time, I didn't wait for it to ring twice. I ripped the cable out of the wall, trying to end this madness once and for all. To my despair, the phone continued ringing even without being connected to anything. I dropped the phone and ran out of there, almost tripping over the old furniture. When I reached the ground floor, I was shaking so much that I could barely hold the keys to my locker. I didn't think twice. I gathered my things and went straight to the supervisor's office to formally resign. I told him everything that had happened, the recordings, the ringing phone, the shadow in the reflection. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disbelief, but didn't try to stop me. He just handed me a form, saying that if I really wanted to leave, it was my right. As I filled it out with each word, I felt the shadowy presence getting closer, as if it didn't want me to leave. The silence in the corridor was so deep that any minimal noise seemed like a scream, and the ding of the elevator on the other side of the lobby made me almost fall out of my chair. For a moment, I thought about finishing the shift, but it was too late to change my mind. I left the building at dawn, swearing never to return, but I still took with me the footage and all the strange records. When I got home, I did one last review of the videos before turning off my phone, and it was at this moment that I saw something in each scene that left me in shock. In the reflection of the elevator mirror, the shadow moved increasingly closer to me, as if extending an arm or trying to whisper something in my ear. I felt a deadly chill run through me and simply couldn't watch until the end. I recorded everything on a flash drive and put it away. But since then, I've had the feeling that something follows me on the street, watches me through windows. Maybe it's just paranoia, but whenever I hear a ding or smell mildew, my heart races. And to this day, nobody has given me a convincing explanation for what happened in that place. Before we move on to the next account, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to receive the next stories. Your presence is important, and your support is essential. Well, let's continue. My name is Emily Winters, and this is the story of how our move to a new house turned into the worst mistake of our lives. My mother, Diana, always dreamed of a spacious home, a place where my brother Noah and I could have plenty of room, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. So when she found an old Victorian house on the outskirts of Millfield, in a neighborhood weathered by time, she didn't hesitate to convince us that it would be the perfect fresh start. The building had a peculiar grandeur, with recently restored walls and large windows that opened to the nearby forest. Surrounded by overgrown bushes and connected to the rest of the town by a gravel road, it conveyed exactly the peace that Mom had always desired. But from the moment we arrived, something seemed off. On our first night, while still unpacking boxes, a sound from the roof made me freeze. Someone or something was walking on the shingles. My father, Marcus, grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. He returned without answers. "Probably just raccoons," he commented, trying to appear calm. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't ignore how his hand trembled slightly as he set down the flashlight. Hours later, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My room was at the end, and the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, expecting Mom or Dad to say something, but the silence was absolute. As days passed, the feeling of unease intensified. One afternoon, while Noah was playing in the living room, a sharp noise came from the kitchen. When we entered, we found a shattered glass on the floor. There was nobody there. "Must have been the wind," my mother murmured, despite the window being closed. But the strangest occurrences involved objects in the house. A photo frame with our family picture, which I had carefully positioned on the shelf, was found turned around the next morning. The day after that, it was on the floor for no reason. "Just coincidence," insisted my father, though his expression betrayed any attempt at reassurance. The situation worsened one night when I suddenly woke up shivering, seeing my own breath form vapor in the air, as if we were in the middle of a harsh winter. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Noah standing motionless in front of the living room window. "What are you doing awake?" I asked. He didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the yard. "There's someone out there," he whispered, pointing. I looked, but all I saw were shadows moving with the wind. I took him back to bed, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Not long after, the voices started. It was as if someone was whispering near my ear, in a low and irregular tone. At first, I thought it was my imagination, until one night during dinner when we all heard a female voice. It echoed clearly through the room, saying, "Why won't you see?" The sound lingered in the air, raising goosebumps on our skin. My mother let the knife slip from her hands, the metal clattering against the floor, while Dad jumped up, searching the room for any device that could have emitted that sound. But as you might guess, nothing was plugged in. No television, no radio, just that strange murmur vibrating in the walls, as if the house was breathing with us. In an effort to dispel the discomfort, Dad turned up the music, trying to fill the rooms with familiar sounds. But it didn't work. The air seemed dense, heavy, as if something invisible was watching us closely. The atmosphere became even stranger the day I found an antique doll forgotten in a storage room. It was covered in dust, with faded blue eyes and a torn dress. As soon as I touched it, a shiver ran up my spine. "Where did this come from?" I asked, feeling a chill in my stomach. My mother frowned, looking as surprised as I was. "Leave it there." I followed her advice and abandoned it in the attic, but that night I dreamed of the doll. In the dream, it was sitting at the edge of my bed, those lifeless eyes fixed on me. I woke with a start, certain that someone had been in the room. And that's when I began to realize we weren't alone in that house. From the second week on, the dreams began to repeat. At first, they were just disconnected flashes. A little girl running down a dark corridor, screaming words I couldn't understand. But over time, the images gained clarity, as if they were memories from another person. The girl appeared to be about 6 years old, black hair falling over her shoulders, and a white dress stained with dirt. In the last dream, she was standing in front of my bedroom door, arms extended, eyes wide and full of desperation. When I tried to ask who she was, she pressed her fingers against her lips as if asking for silence, and whispered something I couldn't understand. It was at that moment that I woke up gasping, my body covered in cold sweat. The changes in me didn't go unnoticed. My mother, always practical, attributed my dark circles to excessive time on my phone. But how could I explain that it was the house that wouldn't let me sleep? One afternoon, while trying to concentrate on homework, a soft noise caught my attention. I thought it was the wind against the window, but as I approached, I clearly saw marks of small hands on the glass, as if someone had pressed it from the outside. My blood ran cold. My room was on the second floor. There was no way someone could have left those marks there. That's when I decided to document what was happening. I started recording videos with my phone. On the first night, I left the camera running while I slept. I reviewed the footage in the morning. For hours, nothing happened. But at 3:15 in the morning, the closet door opened slowly, without any air current, without anyone being there. I tried to show the video to my parents. My mother wouldn't even look. "You're becoming obsessed with these things," she said, washing the dishes with such force that she ended up breaking a plate. My father, on the other hand, asked me to send him the recording. That night, I heard him arguing with my mother. "This isn't normal, Diana. There's something wrong with this house. The only problem here is that you're letting the girl's paranoia influence you," she retorted. I thought about intervening, but gave up. Deep down, I knew it wouldn't help. The tension inside the house increased in the same proportion that the inexplicable events became more frequent. Noah, my younger brother, began refusing to sleep alone after a night when terrified. He claimed to have seen a girl walking down the hallway. The description he gave was exactly the same as the girl who haunted my dreams. The climax came one early morning when I left the camera recording in the living room. Reviewing the footage, a chill ran through my body. A dark shadow crossed the room. It didn't have defined contours, but it moved with intention, as if searching for something. As I analyzed the video at the dining table, my mother found me. At first, she scolded me for wasting time with it, but soon sat down to watch. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. "Don't tell your brother or your father," she whispered, almost voiceless. But we couldn't hide what was happening for long. That same night, the lights began to flicker, and an unbearable smell took over the kitchen. It was something rotten, acidic, difficult to describe. Dad had to open all the windows. "What's that smell?" he asked, covering his nose with his hand. I already knew it was another warning. The next morning, I decided I wouldn't stay idle waiting for things to get worse. If no one else was going to face the situation, then I would. I spent hours researching the house and the area. What I discovered left me speechless. Years ago, a girl had disappeared there. They said a neighbor had kidnapped her, but she was never found. Nights without sleep were taking their toll. My mother, once so skeptical, was beginning to show signs of fatigue and hesitation. One morning, while having coffee, I overheard a hushed conversation between her and my father. "Marcus, we can't continue like this," she murmured, running her hands over her face. I don't know what to do anymore." My father sighed without responding immediately. His eyes were sunken, his countenance heavy. It was the first time I saw in him a shadow of doubt. That afternoon, as I was sweeping the entrance to the house, an elderly neighbor approached. She stopped beside me. "You need help," she said, without beating around the bush. I hesitated. "What do you mean?" The woman made the sign of the cross, looking at the house as if she could see something beyond the walls. "Mrs. Blackwood understands these things. If anyone can help, it's her." And that's how my mother, exhausted after countless sleepless nights, made her decision. It was impossible to ignore the connection. That girl and the one appearing in my dreams were the same. But why was she manifesting now? Why with us specifically? The questions accumulated in my mind, without any answers. The only certainty was that the house hid deep secrets, and with each passing day, it dragged us further into them. When Mrs. Blackwood arrived, the first thing that caught my attention were her eyes, small, grayish, as if they could see beyond what was visible. She wore a black shawl embroidered with golden threads, and carried a small bag from which sprigs of sage protruded. As soon as she crossed the door, she stopped abruptly. Her face hardened. "This house is burdened, deeply burdened," she murmured, closing her eyes and reciting something in what sounded like Latin. Then she turned to my mother and said in a definitive tone, "You shouldn't be here." My father, always skeptical, let out a short, nervous laugh. "And what does that mean?" he questioned, crossing his arms. Mrs. Blackwood didn't respond immediately. She walked slowly through the living room, stopping at corners as if she could feel something in the air. Suddenly, she stopped and stared at me. "You've seen the girl, haven't you?" My heart raced. "How do you know that?" I asked, trying to control the tremor in my voice. She pointed to the empty space near the window. "Because she's here." The temperature suddenly plummeted in the room, and the cold we felt wasn't just the chill of a New England night. It was a freeze that went beyond the skin, reaching the bones, something deep and unsettling. Mrs. Blackwood called us to the dining table, and with a firm voice, began to relate what she knew. This house carries a dark history. Many years ago, a family lived here. The girl whose disappearance was reported never actually left this place. She was murdered. Her own father, consumed by rage, took her life. Her body was buried here, but never found. Some believe he disposed of the remains in another way, perhaps scattering the ashes. Fire and pain have marked this place. My mother brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a moan. But there's something beyond that, Mrs. Blackwood continued. The girl's suffering was so intense that it opened a portal. That pain attracted presences that don't belong to this world. The energy here functions as a beacon for dark entities. "What kind of entities?" my father questioned, his disbelief beginning to waver. Mrs. Blackwood stared at him fixedly. "Wandering souls, shadows that feed on fear, anger, and life essence itself. It's not just the girl who's still here. There's something else that won't allow you to live in peace." That night, Mrs. Blackwood insisted we needed a protection ritual. Although she had warned that the only true way out was to abandon the house. As she arranged the objects, white candles, an incense burner, and a handful of earth taken from her bag, she asked us to stay together in the living room. The air seemed to become denser, as she murmured her prayers. The shadows on the walls seemed to take on a life of their own, oscillating without apparent reason, and the smell of sulfur spread through the room. Suddenly, one of the candles went out, even without any air current. "They don't want us to be here," said Mrs. Blackwood tensely. "Something is watching us." It was then that a loud noise echoed from upstairs, making us jump. The sound was strong, as if a heavy object had fallen, but when we checked, we found nothing out of place. Noah began to cry, and my mother tried to comfort him, though her fingers trembled. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, and then we saw it in the doorway of the living room. A tall, misshapen silhouette rose up, a dense shadow that seemed to devour the light around it. There was no face, only an oppressive presence that imposed itself before us. "Don't move," shouted Mrs. Blackwood, but it was impossible to stay still. The entity advanced, and a suffocating grip took hold of my chest, as if it were draining the air from my lungs. The sage in Mrs. Blackwood's hands began to burn spontaneously, releasing a dense and choking smoke into the air. "Get out of here." "Go away," yelled Mrs. Blackwood, waving the sage toward the shadow. The figure receded slowly until it disappeared, but the weight of its presence remained. That night, no one closed their eyes. We all huddled in my parents' room, unable to separate even for an instant. I had never felt such visceral fear as I did that night. When day broke, Mrs. Blackwood gave her final assessment. "If you stay here, you'll leave marked. The girl only seeks justice, but the other presences want to destroy you. There's nothing more that can be done." My parents exchanged a silent look, still unable to fully accept the reality. But I knew because I had already seen it in my dreams and felt it in my skin. This house didn't just want to scare us, it wanted to consume us. If we didn't leave soon, it would succeed. The attack happened at dusk, just when we thought we had survived the worst night. Noah, my little brother, was alone in his room, hugging his old teddy bear, when we heard his scream, a sharp, desperate sound that tore through the silence of the house like a sharp blade. We ran immediately. When we arrived, we found him huddled in a corner, trembling, his nails dug into the wall. His eyes were wide with pure terror, as if they had seen something his mind couldn't comprehend. We tried to calm him down, but then we noticed the marks on his neck. There was the clear outline of long fingers, longer than any person's. "We can't stay here another second," sobbed my mother, holding Noah tightly against her. This time my father didn't contest. His face was livid, his eyes sunken from sleep deprivation, and from the weight of what he finally accepted as real. Without hesitation, he began to gather our things. That afternoon, we abandoned the house without ceremony, without goodbyes, and without looking back. Mrs. Blackwood had been clear. We should leave without regrets, without carrying anything that could tie us to that place. "Don't take anything of sentimental value," she warned. "This house never belonged to you." As we drove away, I was overcome by a mixture of relief and emptiness. We had arrived full of expectations, dreaming of a new beginning, but we left with empty hands, taking with us only the fear and the invisible marks that would never fade. We never tried to live in an isolated place again. My parents chose a small apartment downtown, where the constant movement of the streets, the noise, and the lights became a kind of refuge. Noah, although shaken, recovered gradually, but he never mentioned that night again. As for me, I still dream about everything sometimes. I see the girl with those eyes, begging for something I can't give. Other times, it's the shadow that returns, trying to finish what it started. But nothing compares to the sensation that accompanies me to this day, that the evil of that place was never truly eradicated, and somewhere out there, it still waits, patient and hungry, for its next family. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel, and I'm 32 years old. I've been working as a nurse for almost 8 years, and when I received the news that I had been accepted at a prestigious hospital in Boston, I was so overwhelmed with joy that I could barely contain my tears. I had spent years searching for an opportunity at a renowned institution where I could learn more and grow professionally. My family always supported me, but I felt I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of taking this important step in my career. The moment I stepped into the hospital, the atmosphere of pristine corridors and cutting-edge equipment filled me with hope. It felt as though I had finally arrived where I had always dreamed of being. On my very first day, I was greeted by my new supervisor, Diana, who escorted me to the trauma center where I would be stationed. She had a polite smile, but there was something unsettling in her gaze, a kind of coldness that's difficult to explain. I didn't give it much thought initially, attributing it to the stress of the busy winter season. I couldn't help but notice how my colleagues seemed subdued around her, always looking at the floor or disguising their anxiety. Nevertheless, I focused on my work and showed dedication, as that was my way of earning respect and trust. Deep down, I believed that by being a committed professional, everything would go smoothly. As the first weeks passed, I got into the rhythm of the hospital and won the sympathy of several patients. I've always enjoyed conversing while administering medications or changing dressings, asking simple questions like, "Are you comfortable?" or "How was your night?" These small gestures create a bond of trust, and for me, being a nurse is much more than just following protocols. It's about caring for people who are vulnerable. However, I noticed that my work style was drawing Diana's attention in a way I couldn't quite decipher. Sometimes I would catch her observing me from a distance, unblinking, which left me with an uncomfortable feeling. It wasn't long before strange situations began to occur. Small things like missing charts that I was absolutely certain I had placed in the correct location. On other occasions, I would arrive for my shift and discover that my schedule had been altered without any prior notice, making me appear irresponsible in front of the team. I tried to discuss these issues with Diana, but she always denied knowing anything, with that same cold look and a subtle smile that seemed full of sarcasm. I tried to stay calm, but deep down, something told me there was a very clear intention behind these accidents. I made efforts not to let these small sabotages shake my confidence, but they began to affect my routine. Every time I noticed an error in a chart or found equipment in the wrong place, I grew suspicious that Diana was behind it all. In the corridors, some colleagues avoided eye contact with me, as if they were afraid of being seen talking to me. The few who paid attention to me dropped hints about keeping your head down if you don't want to get burned. I couldn't understand how someone could feed off the fear of others, But I started to see that this was exactly what was happening there. The feeling that I was walking on eggshells grew, and my sleep was already showing signs that it wouldn't be the same anymore. By the third week of work, I began experiencing more frequent headaches, to the point where they bothered me during my shifts. Nothing worked, not painkillers, not cold compresses. Sometimes I needed to lean against the medication counter to breathe deeply, waiting for the pain to pass. The atmosphere in the department seemed to grow heavy whenever Diana appeared, and I can't deny that I began to associate her presence with my migraines. At night, sleep wouldn't come properly. Even exhausted, I would toss in bed, thinking about everything that had happened during the day, mentally reviewing each detail to make sure I hadn't made any mistakes. But the errors continued to appear, even though I carefully reviewed each procedure. Every now and then, Diana would call me into her office with that tone of false concern to tell me that my reports were incomplete, or that there was a complaint from a patient about me. I could never get concrete evidence that she was fabricating these incidents, but everything sounded too artificial. One patient even confided in me that she really liked me and would never have complained, contradicting what Diana had said. My head was already full of doubts and tension. One morning, I felt such a heavy weight on my chest that I thought I might faint. With my health beginning to fail and the toxic environment becoming unbearable, I started to wonder if it was time to give up on this dream hospital. I didn't want to admit that it might be better to leave the job, because I had fought so hard to get there. Besides, I felt that turning my back would be acknowledging that she had won, and that went against everything I believed in as a professional. Even so, the insomnia worsened. The migraines seemed to take up permanent residence in my head, and I no longer recognized myself. It was at this point that I realized I needed help, but I still wasn't sure who to turn to. The fear of retaliation spoke louder, and ironically, I felt increasingly alone in that place full of people. Gradually, I realized that it wasn't just me suffering from Diana's control. Some nursing technicians and even younger doctors seemed to act as if they were under constant surveillance, choosing each word before speaking. One evening, a colleague approached me in the cafeteria and said in an almost whispered tone that he had also experienced similar problems when he joined the department. That conversation gave me momentary relief, because I confirmed that I wasn't alone or paranoid. But it also made me even more tense because apparently, Diana chose her victims carefully, perhaps the most dedicated ones, or those who stood out easily. Every second in the hospital now was charged with heavy energy, and I could no longer divert my thoughts from the idea that something worse could happen. To try to maintain my sanity, I started to note everything down in a small notebook: schedules, procedures, patient names, and even important dialogues I witnessed. I wanted to have concrete evidence in case I was accused of something again, even though I knew it wouldn't be easy to present a notebook as official evidence. It gave me a bit of mental security. My concern was that Diana would discover it and turn against me even more aggressively. Still, it was a risk I was willing to take because my mental health was already fragile. My body was crying out for rest. The dark circles under my eyes became constant, and occasionally my heart would race for no apparent reason. One day, I received a call from my father asking if everything was okay with me. He said my voice sounded distant, almost apathetic, and that I seemed like a stranger even to him. It was at that moment that I realized how much I was immersed in a toxic environment. I tried to keep my head high so as not to show weakness, but the truth is that the situation was destroying me inside. As much as I had the dream of growing in the hospital, nothing justified the price I was paying. And yet, I hesitated to make a drastic decision, perhaps for fear of confirming that all my effort would have been in vain. After a particularly bad night when I simply couldn't close my eyes, I noticed that my symptoms had gotten much worse. The headache was now constant, without respite, and the weight on my chest made breathing deeply an arduous task. At the hospital, I tried to disguise it so as not to alarm anyone, but I needed to stop in the bathroom several times to compose myself. That day, I nearly let a tear escape in front of Diana when she appeared with yet another absurd accusation. A missing chart that I supposedly should have delivered. It was the point where I seriously began to question whether it was really worth continuing to fight in that place. The last straw came on a Tuesday afternoon when I had to redo a simple procedure, changing a patient's IV drip, because the system showed that I hadn't performed the service. I remember that the patient himself was indignant and even confirmed to the coordination that I had done everything correctly. But still, Diana acted as if I were guilty of some failure in the record. This time, however, something inside me broke. The tiredness, exhaustion, and all the frustration accumulated until then exploded at once. Before I realized it, my voice echoed through the department. "Enough, Diana. I know what you're doing." Her cold gaze flickered with a shadow of surprise, but her expression soon returned to the same subtle smile. "I don't know what you're talking about, Rachel. Maybe you're tired. Tired of being sabotaged. Tired of seeing you manipulate the team through fear." "Absolutely. And you know what's worse. You're not only hurting me, but everyone here. They're afraid of you, and you feed off it." A heavy silence spread throughout the room. I saw some averted gazes, but I noticed that one or two colleagues were finally raising their heads. For a second, I thought Diana would react with her usual coldness, but I perceived something different, discomfort. She stared at me for a few more seconds before letting out a low, humorless laugh. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know more than you imagine," I retorted firmly, feeling my gaze not conveying fear anymore, but fury. But what I didn't know yet was that I would soon have to prove something that seemed much bigger than I initially thought. What once seemed a sign of weakness had now become a matter of survival. I decided to formalize my resignation request the following week. But before I could even deliver my resignation letter, something unexpected happened at the hospital. A patient died during a routine surgical procedure, and rumors began to circulate wildly through the corridors. Tension gripped everyone, and I immediately realized there was something strange about the story. Information circulated that a serious medical error had been committed, supposedly in the prescription or administration of a medication. However, many commented in hushed voices that all the chaos was linked to Diana's supervision, who had allegedly made last-minute changes or neglected some important alert. In less than 24 hours, an internal investigation was opened, and the administration decided to remove Diana from her position until everything was clarified. The news spread through the floors like wildfire, and I remember the mixture of relief and fear that I felt. Relief because the person who terrorized me so much would no longer be there to torture me. Fear because a human being had lost their life, something irreversible and devastating. I went home that night, exhausted, with my mind racing. But curiously, for the first time in weeks, I managed to sleep a little better. I didn't have nightmares. I didn't wake up with a throbbing head, and the weight on my chest was gradually dissipating. The next day, I woke up without any pain, as if my body had finally received permission to rest. It was almost surreal. The insomnia, the migraines, all that horrible feeling of being suffocated, everything had disappeared without leaving a trace. I confess that for a few moments, I wondered if I wasn't dreaming. The investigation revealed something even more disturbing than we could have imagined. Diana had been systematically altering patient records to discredit staff members she saw as threats. The patient who died had been given medication he was allergic to, and Diana had erased the allergy note from his chart just minutes before the surgery. She wasn't just trying to get people fired. Her actions had crossed into something far more sinister. Further investigation uncovered a pattern. 3 other hospitals where Diana had worked previously had experienced unexplained patient incidents. She would establish herself as indispensable, create chaos, and then heroically fix the problem she herself had caused. It was a twisted form of what psychologists later called a savior complex, mixed with extreme narcissism. I could only conclude that somehow all the emotional pressure that Diana exerted on me, directly or indirectly, had triggered my symptoms. I was even more shocked by how quickly everything resolved after she was removed. It's frightening to think about the power someone can have over our mental and physical health. The hospital administration implemented a new oversight system with checks and balances that would prevent any single person from having too much control. They also established a confidential reporting system where staff could safely document concerning behaviors. Although I still don't know exactly how to feel about everything, I needed to share this experience to alert others that toxic environments and people can affect us in unimaginable ways. For now, I've decided to stay at the hospital to honor my patients, but I won't deny that I look back and shudder just remembering what I went through. My story isn't unique. Workplace bullying happens in every profession, but perhaps it's most dangerous in healthcare, where lives are literally at stake. If you're facing something similar, please remember that your wellness matters not just for you, but for everyone who depends on you. Document everything, find allies, and know when to speak up sometimes. As in my case, you might discover you're not the only victim. Thank you for listening to my story. If you're still here, let me know what time you're listening to this. I like to know who stays until the end of my narratives. Take care of yourselves. Some places, despite seeming welcoming at first glance, harbor an atmosphere that's difficult to explain. Sometimes it's nothing at all. Other times it's just that uncomfortable feeling we try to ignore. But what about when small details begin to accumulate? When something inside you insists that something is wrong, even without a clear reason. It's not always explainable, but it's certainly felt. Good evening, everyone. I've never been one to believe in these kinds of things, but what I experienced in this apartment made me question a lot. I need to share this story to try to understand if everything was just in my head or if there was something more there. My name is Cassidy. I'm 31 years old, and when all this happened, I had just moved into a new apartment in a historic district of New Orleans. My husband, Ethan, and I had been looking for a larger place that would fit into our budget. And when we found this old property, we were excited. The neighborhood was so quiet that it bordered on eerie, which was exactly how we liked it. During our first visit, I felt something strange in the building. I attributed this impression to the musty smell in the hallways and the creaking floors beneath my feet. Ethan didn't notice anything. He could only think about the money we'd save and the convenience of living close to work. The truth is, deep down, I also convinced myself it was too good an opportunity to pass up. It was a spacious apartment with 2 bedrooms, a large living room, and a kitchen illuminated by a window that overlooked an interior courtyard. I clung to the idea that this could be our fresh start, away from the noise and stress of city life. The first few weeks were as peaceful as I'd imagined, even boring. I managed to organize all the furniture in the right places and even gave the walls a refresh, painting each room with light, cozy colors. I love decorating, so I spent days buying ornaments, pictures, and lamps to make our little corner more welcoming. During these intervals, I occasionally noticed a curious gaze coming from the window of the floor above, but I preferred to ignore it. I later discovered that an elderly woman named Mrs. Winters lived there, rarely came downstairs, and according to the few neighbors I met, didn't like to talk. I wasn't too concerned about her. I've always believed that elderly people have their own quirks and routines. What really started to bother me were the anonymous notes that appeared in my mailbox with strange phrases like, "You shouldn't be here." I thought it was some kind of bad joke, but it brought back the uncomfortable feeling I'd had on the first day. I talked to Ethan about the notes, but he was skeptical. "You shouldn't pay attention to such nonsense," he said, shaking his head. I understood his point of view, but it was hard to ignore the strangeness, especially when it came from the neighbors themselves, in an apparently peaceful place. My routine began to feel heavier. I felt watched all the time and considered installing security cameras, but our resources were limited, and the rent was already a burden. So I abandoned the idea, opting only to lock the doors and windows securely. It was during this time that something changed within me. I began to have frequent insomnia, tossing in bed for hours until I could fall asleep. When I finally drifted off, nightmares haunted me, always placing me in dark rooms with the sensation of being suffocated by someone I couldn't see. Upon waking, my heart would race, and I'd notice I was breathless and sweaty, as if I had really lived through it. Ethan, on the other hand, slept deeply without noticing anything strange. The nights became a torment, and during the day I walked around exhausted, unable to concentrate on basic household tasks. I began to lose hair, which left me desperate because I've always been vain and take great care of my appearance. My hair would fall out in clumps in the shower, and even when I lightly ran my hand over my head. To make matters worse, my skin also turned pale, and I felt weak, with a constant dizziness that seemed to have no explanation. I went back to the doctor several times, had blood tests, and nothing abnormal was detected, which made me even more nervous. I couldn't explain it rationally, but I was certain that the apartment seemed to reject me in some way. It was as if the walls were heavy, carrying an energy that fed on my vitality. It wasn't long before I began to suspect Mrs. Winters as the author of the notes. One day, I went up to the floor above to try to talk to her and clarify the whole situation. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered, although I was sure I heard dragging footsteps heading toward the door. I insisted a bit more, knocking with my fingers, but nothing. The corridor was plunged into an uncomfortable silence, the kind that makes your ears buzz. I ended up feeling ridiculous and went back down. But when I reached my floor, I had the impression of hearing her doorknob turn, as if someone was spying. The sensation of being constantly watched intensified. On the rare occasions when I went out to go to the market or the pharmacy, I felt eyes on me, as if they wanted to expel me. I tried to keep my head high, but the anxiety grew with each note that appeared in my mailbox. One of these sleepless nights, I heard noises coming from the floor above. Strong, dragging footsteps, followed by a kind of murmur. I woke up startled, grabbed my phone to look at the time. It was past 3 in the morning. Normally, I would attribute this to old plumbing or imagination, but it seemed very real. Ethan slept heavily beside me, breathing calmly, and I even nudged him to wake up and help me understand what was happening. But he just turned in bed, complaining of fatigue. So I decided to get up and go to the living room, to see if through the window I could see any light on in Mrs. Winter's apartment. Nothing. The building was pitch black. I returned to the bedroom with a strange feeling, as if there was a presence observing my every step, but not showing itself openly. As the days passed, besides the nightmares, I began to have anxiety attacks that left me in an almost paranoid state. My body seemed to be withering more and more. My face became hollow, and the simple act of climbing the building's stairs left me breathless. To avoid fatigue, I started using the elevator, although I hated that slow, noisy cubicle. One afternoon, while returning from the market, I felt a sudden chill upon entering the elevator. It seemed like someone was standing behind me, even when the cabin was empty. I even thought I heard fingers snapping near my ear, but when I looked around, I found nothing to justify it. It was desperate because I could no longer distinguish what was the fruit of my imagination and what was real. Ethan continued not to notice anything abnormal, and that only made me feel more alone and insecure. Meanwhile, I tried to find some distraction. I went back to painting watercolors on the balcony and tried to watch light series so as not to feed this heavy climate. But even the paint dried in a strange way, forming stains that reminded me of distorted faces. Perhaps it was pure coincidence, but I saw it as another sign that something very wrong was happening. I was already considering the possibility of looking for another place, but Ethan thought this sudden move would be an unnecessary expense, and that I just needed to rest better. In fact, I had hoped that over time everything would normalize, but a part of me knew that these events were becoming increasingly intense. And as I observed that silent and apparently empty floor above, my heart beat out of rhythm, as if warning me that something much worse was yet to come. Then came the night when everything seemed to crumble completely. I was exhausted from another day of insomnia and anxiety, so much so that I fell asleep almost immediately upon lying down. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but I remember opening my eyes and realizing I couldn't move. My entire body was paralyzed, and my chest rose and fell in a tremendous effort to pull in air. I was completely terrified to feel as if an invisible hand was weighing on my chest, preventing me from breathing properly. I tried to call out to Ethan, but my voice wouldn't come out. It was as if my throat was being squeezed. My gaze ran around the room looking for any sign of light, and all I found was a strange shadow in the corner, close to the floor, that seemed to pulse slightly each time I tried to catch my breath. I've never felt so powerless in my entire life. When I finally managed to let out a weak moan, the pressure seemed to decrease, and the room returned to normal in the blink of an eye. Ethan woke up startled, shaking me by the shoulder, but I could barely explain what had happened. I felt a mixture of relief and panic, because that sensation of not being able to move wasn't just a nightmare. I was conscious the whole time. I spent the rest of the night crying with the light on, not daring to close my eyes again. The following morning, my face was swollen from tears, and I couldn't stop trembling. It was then that I made the decision to seek help in some way. I needed to understand why this was happening to me, why I felt consumed, and mainly why the apartment seemed to turn against me. I talked to a new neighbor who had recently moved to the ground floor, Rachel, and she referred me to a spiritual healer who lived a few streets away. She's a very wise woman. They call her Madame Josephine, said Rachel with a worried look. This wasn't something I would normally do, seek out a healer, but I was so desperate that I agreed immediately. I called Madame Josephine, and to my surprise, she promptly attended to me. We arranged to meet that same afternoon, as I felt I couldn't wait any longer. After hanging up the phone, a thought came to my mind. Could this be the push I needed to finally discover the truth about that place? I left the house under Ethan's suspicious gaze, who still had reservations about this type of spiritual practice. He didn't accompany me because he needed to resolve some pending work matters, and I preferred to go alone anyway. The healer's address was in an old house with a simple but welcoming facade. As soon as Madame Josephine opened the door, I felt enveloped by an aroma of fresh herbs like sage and rosemary. She led me to a modest room full of plant pots and religious images from various creeds. Without me saying much, she looked into my eyes and stated in a serene voice, "There is something very dark around you." I felt my legs tremble, but I took a deep breath and told her everything, from the notes to the nocturnal suffocation, the presence of Mrs. Winters, and the sensation that the apartment simply hated me. She listened attentively, without showing any surprise. As soon as I finished my account, Madame Josephine closed her eyes and breathed deeply, as if absorbing my words to later return them in the form of understanding. "This is not the first similar case I've attended to in this neighborhood," she revealed, opening her eyes. "The presence you feel doesn't come just from Mrs. Winters, but also from an older energy trapped in the apartment. There are rumors that a young woman named Eliza lived there before you and simply disappeared without a trace," she continued. "From what I've heard from other people, Mrs. Winters has a mysterious connection with Eliza, perhaps of friendship or protection, and knows that any woman who tries to live in that apartment will suffer the consequences of a resentful energy that doesn't want to be replaced. I was paralyzed, trying to process the idea of occupying the space of someone who had never actually left. It took me a few seconds to react, with my heart racing. My first reaction was to think that this was fantasy. But then I remembered the nightmares, the notes, and how my body was deteriorating without explanation. Everything began to make sense. Madame Josephine told me that, from all indications, Mrs. Winters had done a work to expel me, not out of pure whim, but because she feared what might happen to me if I remained there. The healer proposed performing a ritual to break the spell using herbs, prayers, and a bath of coarse salt. I accepted without hesitation, willing to do anything to end that nightmare. During the ritual, I felt an intense heat spread through my body, as if something was being torn from me. It was uncomfortable, but at the same time brought an immediate sensation of relief. Upon returning home, I noticed that the atmosphere seemed lighter, as if the air circulated better. The oppressive sensation and the weight on my shoulders had disappeared. In the following nights, I managed to sleep without having nightmares, and my insomnia gradually diminished. Even my hair stopped falling out so much, and I recovered part of my energy. Ethan noticed the change and was even impressed, although he didn't want to admit that the ritual might have helped. However, Mrs. Winters had disappeared, not just from my sight, but from the entire building. I went to her apartment again and found the door locked with no sign of movement. I asked the neighbors, and they all said they hadn't seen the elderly woman for days. Her bills also hadn't been paid, and the lights on the floor above remained off, suggesting that no one lived there anymore. Her disappearance began to raise suspicions, but no one could say for certain what had happened. Everything was shrouded in a strange silence, as if people were afraid to speak. It was then that I decided to investigate a bit more about Eliza and the possible connection with Mrs. Winters. I spoke with a janitor who had worked there for years, Mr. Sullivan. He was reluctant at first, but ended up telling me that one day he saw Eliza leave in a hurry, looking upset, and never returned. Mrs. Winters spent weeks in a state of shock, talking to herself in the corridors, mentioning she shouldn't stay there several times. She seemed desperate that no one approach the upstairs apartment where she lived, he told me. I was intrigued. Why would Mrs. Winters be so afraid of someone inhabiting that property? Mr. Sullivan ventured to say that she feared the presence that still lingered there, as if Eliza's energy still roamed each room. He himself never wanted to enter to fix anything, and when the building manager hired other people to make repairs, they all complained of inexplicable chills. To this day, I have no idea where Mrs. Winters went, or if she left of her own accord, or if something took her away. On one hand, I feel genuine relief to have peace back in my home. On the other, I can't forget Eliza's story and the fact that her disappearance was never resolved. Sometimes I still feel a chill when passing through the corridor, or when looking at the corner of the room during the early hours, as if part of that energy persists, silently observing. I don't dare to investigate further, because I fear what I might find. Deep down, I believe Mrs. Winters did what she thought necessary to protect someone or something, and that she knew much more than she ever shared with the neighborhood. Questions remain unanswered, but I've learned to deal with this. I prefer to keep the door locked to the unknown that roams this old building. And if one day she reappears, or if Eliza's presence manifests again, I hope to be prepared to deal with whatever inhabits these walls. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I post new videos every day here. Hope to see you in the next ones. On screen now, I'll leave 2 other good videos that I know you'll enjoy. See you there. On a bitter cold night in February, 5 young men mysteriously vanished from their warm car, venturing into the darkness of the Oregon wilderness. Their disappearance would become one of the most perplexing mysteries in Pacific Northwest history, leaving investigators and families searching for answers that seemed lost in the depths of the forest. The pungent scent of decay permeated the crisp mountain air as 3 motorcyclists pulled off the main trail. It was early June 1983, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the towering Douglas firs. After a long day of riding, they had decided to investigate an odd cluster of buildings nestled in a secluded clearing just beyond the tree line. Before them stood a weather-worn meteorological station, a main building flanked by 4 smaller structures. Such stations weren't uncommon in this part of Oregon, positioned strategically across the wilderness for monitoring weather patterns and collecting atmospheric data. Most were regularly staffed, but this remote outpost had clearly been abandoned to the elements, or so they thought. The nauseating odor grew stronger as the riders removed their helmets. 2 of them recognized it immediately, the unmistakable smell of death. They initially assumed it was a dead animal decomposing in the summer heat, the stench enough to make one of them retch. They might have left right then, but the broken window in the main building caught their attention. Peering through the shattered glass revealed little at first, just some dusty workstations and weather monitoring equipment untouched for months. The door yielded easily to their push, unlocked and slightly ajar. What they discovered inside would haunt them forever. A body lay on a cot in the back room, covered with 8 thick blankets, swarming with flies. None of the riders could have known they had just stumbled upon the first piece of a tragic puzzle, one that would come to be known as the Oregon Mountain Mystery. This discovery would lead investigators down a winding path of confusion and heartbreak, with more questions than answers at every turn. The authorities, already en route, had a sinking suspicion about the identity of the deceased. Their fears were confirmed upon arrival. The body belonged to one of 5 young men who had vanished 4 months earlier in the dead of winter. But the evidence before them defied logic. As the investigation unfolded, nearly every detail would seem to contradict the next, leaving them with a modern mystery as perplexing as any in the annals of American history. To understand this enigma, we must return to where it all began, the early evening of Friday, February 18th, 1983. The winter air in Portland, Oregon hung heavy with the promise of snow as 25-year-old Michael Donovan sat at his kitchen table, hurriedly finishing his dinner. Between bites of his mother's meatloaf, he kept glancing eagerly out the window at the empty street, anticipating the arrival of his friends. Earlier that evening, 32-year-old Robert Bob Peterson had rushed downstairs for dinner, wolfing down his food at an alarming pace. Minutes later, the sound of a car horn brought him running to the door. Despite his grandmother Martha's insistence that he take a coat, Peterson darted out into the cold night air. In the driveway sat a 1975 Plymouth Fury, with David Morrison, 29, behind the wheel. Alex Fisher, 24, occupied the passenger seat, while 27-year-old Peter O'Reilly sat in the back. Peterson jumped in, and they headed to pick up Donovan before setting out on their 2-hour journey to Portland State University. Each of them shared an intense passion for basketball, following both local games and professional matches whenever possible. They even played on their own team, the Portland Pioneers, and had a crucial game scheduled for the following day. It was the latest in a series of regional tournaments that could qualify them for the upcoming Special Olympics, promising a trip to Seattle if they secured victory. What made this case particularly poignant was that all 5 men faced various mental and developmental challenges. They were part of the Portland Rehabilitation Center's vocational program, where they learned trade skills while playing on the center's basketball team. Bob Peterson, the eldest, had the cognitive development of a young child, but possessed a warm, friendly nature that endeared him to everyone he met. His closest friend was Peter O'Reilly, who shared his childlike wonder and deep religious faith. Alex Fisher, though the shortest at 5 feet 9 inches, had a subtle charm that emerged when he felt comfortable. He and Peterson were inseparable, with the older man often acting as his protector and spokesperson. David Morrison had served in the Navy, but received a medical discharge. Though not diagnosed with any specific disability, those who knew him described him as having a slower processing speed than most. Still, he managed to obtain a driver's license and took great pride in his Plymouth Fury. Michael Donovan had also served in the military, stationed in South Korea. But after a stress-induced breakdown in 1980, he was diagnosed with severe PTSD and honorably discharged. He'd been taking prescribed medication for 3 years, showing remarkable improvement, and even securing a job at his stepfather's construction company. During the drive to Portland, the friends chatted excitedly about their upcoming game. Their families had laid out their uniforms that evening, ready for what should have been their big moment the next day. Tragically, they would never get to play that game. That night, through a mysterious chain of events, all 5 men would vanish into the darkness of the Oregon wilderness. When none of them returned home that evening, their worried families began calling each other and the police. This behavior was completely out of character. None of them were prone to staying out late without notice. Even Donovan, who occasionally spent evenings with other veterans, always called his mother if he would be late. The police quickly issued a missing persons bulletin, and soon information began trickling in from Portland. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing them at the basketball game, and several recalled seeing Morrison's distinctive Plymouth Fury leaving the university parking lot afterward. A convenience store clerk reported them buying snacks, milk, and sodas just before closing time. As the first snowflakes began to fall, police launched a widespread search, led by Portland Detective Marcus Reynolds, who had known Peterson since high school. Reynolds took the case personally, expanding the search into the surrounding Mount Hood National Forest area. His determination paid off when news came that Morrison's Plymouth had been found on a remote Forest Service road, 70 miles from Portland, on February 22nd. The car was buried in several inches of snow, but had been carefully parked on the shoulder. Inside, they found snack wrappers scattered across the seats, and 4 maps neatly folded in the glove compartment. The vehicle was in perfect working order, though the keys were missing. Puzzlingly, nearly a quarter tank of gas remained, more than enough to have driven back to Portland. With mechanical failure and empty fuel tank ruled out, investigators wondered what had compelled 5 men to abandon a perfectly good vehicle on a freezing winter night. Further searches were hampered by continuing snowstorms, forcing authorities to postpone additional efforts until spring. For Reynolds, the investigation became an obsession. He pursued every lead, no matter how unlikely, while the families offered rewards for information. Tips poured in daily alleged sightings from Seattle to San Diego, each one leading nowhere. Then came the breakthrough in early June, when 3 motorcyclists discovered the body in the abandoned weather station. The deceased was identified as Bob Peterson, who appeared to have died from exposure despite being wrapped in multiple blankets. His 200-pound frame had wasted to nearly half its original weight, suggesting weeks of starvation. Even more baffling, Peterson's shoes were missing, and his feet showed severe frostbite damage. The length of his unkempt beard indicated he had survived for nearly 8 weeks, yet he had never left the cot. Investigators found several empty military-style food ration packets on the floor, evidence that he had eaten at some point. They also discovered an unlocked storage cabinet containing enough freeze-dried food to sustain several people for months, completely untouched. Detective Reynolds was stunned to find no attempt had been made to light a fire, despite an abundance of matches and paper materials that could have served as fuel. Most perplexing of all, a propane tank behind the station was full and operational. It could have provided heat for weeks, yet no one had activated it. The next day, search teams found David Morrison's body 11 miles from the station, near the road leading back toward the car. Evidence suggested he had died while walking, his remains partially scavenged by wildlife. His favorite watch remained clutched in his intact hand. Across the road, scattered bones later identified as Peter O'Reilly's remains were found spread across a wooded area, along with shreds of his distinctive clothing. The devastating news of 3 deaths rocked the Portland community. 2 days later, against Reynolds' advice, Alex Fisher's father joined the search and made the heartbreaking discovery of his son's remains. First a vertebra and some clothing, then additional bones confirmed through dental records. Michael Donovan's whereabouts remained a mystery, causing particular concern due to his need for medication. His shoes were found in the weather station, suggesting he had been there with Peterson and had possibly traded them for his friend's larger boots when frostbite swelled his feet. To this day, Donovan's body has never been found. Investigators theorized that the men had become lost while driving and abandoned their car as the snowstorm intensified. They apparently walked over 20 miles through treacherous mountain terrain before finding the weather station. Once inside, they searched for food and heat, but failed to locate the stored supplies or activate the propane system. With Peterson's condition deteriorating, Morrison, O'Reilly, and Fisher may have left to seek help, leaving Donovan to care for their friend. If they departed around the time the blizzard struck on February 22nd, it would have been their final mistake. If Donovan had indeed stayed behind, he might have later attempted to find his friends. A quarter-mile northwest of the station, searchers found 3 blankets and a corroded flashlight, suggesting he may have tried to bring warmth to his companions, but became lost in the attempt. The central question remained: why had they driven so far into the wilderness? The road was nowhere near the route between Portland and their homes. None of them had ever visited that area before, though Peterson and O'Reilly had once gone camping in a different part of the forest as children. Morrison's mother later suggested someone must have chased them up that mountain road, but she couldn't imagine who could have threatened 5 strong, capable men. A possible clue emerged when Detective Reynolds interviewed Joseph Walsh, who reported being stranded on the same road the night of February 18th. After his car got stuck and he suffered a mild heart attack, Walsh spent the night in his vehicle. Around 2 in the morning, he heard strange whistling sounds and saw several men and a woman carrying what appeared to be a baby, illuminated by car headlights about 100 feet away. Walsh called out for help, but the figures rushed back to their vehicle and disappeared into the darkness. Later that night, he was awakened again by lights and whistling, but couldn't identify the source. When his car ran out of fuel at 5 in the morning, Walsh was forced to walk 8 miles to a ranger station. Along the way, he passed Morrison's Plymouth, but thought nothing of it at the time. Walsh's account aligned with early reports of men allegedly confronting the 5 friends in the university parking lot. Several people at a local diner believed they had seen the group stop to make phone calls, but these leads led nowhere. In recent years, darker theories have emerged. In an online forum post from 2017, someone claiming to be Fisher's sister-in-law shared previously unreported details. She believed the men had witnessed a violent altercation between a woman and several men at the basketball game. When they intervened, it led to a confrontation that ended with Donovan being attacked, prompting his friends to flee in panic up the mountain road. Another detail allegedly omitted from official reports was the discovery of bullet casings at the entrance to the forest road. Had someone fired at their car as they fled? If so, how to explain their stop at the convenience store? This detail only raised more questions than answers. Theories about what happened that February night range from Donovan experiencing a PTSD episode that led them up the mountain, to supernatural encounters in the forest. Like similar cases of mysterious disappearances, this one has generated endless speculation, but few concrete answers. The men, though adults, retained much of their childhood innocence. Except for Donovan and possibly Morrison, they possessed the minds of young boys. What makes this case particularly heartbreaking is imagining their fear and confusion during those final days, especially since the full truth of what led to their deaths remains unknown. Their families still hope for answers, particularly about Donovan's fate. For now, the Oregon Mountain mystery stands as a testament to the unpredictable dangers of wilderness and the endless capacity of nature to keep its secrets. What secrets lie hidden beneath the Earth's surface, in the vast network of underground lakes, rivers, and caverns that honeycomb our planet's crust? Could ancient creatures, long believed extinct, still thrive in these lightless realms? Or might strange beings, as elusive as they are mysterious, inhabit these subterranean waters? There is definitely something down there. The question is, what? The underground waterways that thread through our planet's bedrock are as fascinating as they are enigmatic. Humans have long been drawn to these hidden aquatic realms that permeate the Earth's crust. They represent one of the last true frontiers of exploration on our planet, seeding our wildest dreams and fueling our darkest fears. We have barely scratched the surface of this mysterious underground world. In fact, more people have reached the summit of Mount Everest than have explored the deepest underground river systems. Despite centuries of cave exploration, 90% of Earth's underground water systems remain unmapped. Of the thousands of new species discovered each year, a significant portion emerge from these subterranean environments. This striking fact points to an ominous truth. There could be countless unknown creatures still lurking in those depths. For generations, cave explorers have reported terrifying encounters with various underground monsters, with perhaps the most infamous being the legendary giant cave serpent of the Piku Caves. In modern times, these accounts have largely been dismissed as tall tales told to frighten novice cavers or discourage illegal exploration. But you may be surprised to learn that sightings of so-called cave and underground lake monsters are as common today as they were in years past. Interest in this subject experienced a dramatic surge in 2016 when unusual seismic vibrations were detected deep within the Blue Hall Cave system by the International Underground Research Organization. The signal was so powerful it was picked up by monitoring stations over 50 miles away. Scientists referred to it simply as the pulse, and initially suspected it must have been produced by some massive unknown creature moving through the cave system. By 2018, researchers had concluded it was merely the sound of an underground river carving out new passages. However, imaginations had already been captured, and people began taking stories of underground monsters more seriously. The legend of the giant cave serpent dates back thousands of years. Ancient Sanskrit texts mention a similar creature, but it was Professor Richard Waterman's 2012 book, Secrets of the Underground Rivers, that first described one in detail. Waterman wrote that according to local cave guides, it was large enough to swallow a small boat whole, and its body was long enough to block entire underground passages. These accounts were generally treated skeptically, and no serious scientist gave them much credence. However, in 2019, the story began shifting from folklore to scientific investigation. Dr. Margaret Stone examined mysterious scale-like impressions discovered in limestone deposits deep within the dark water caverns. Each impression was over 12 inches wide, far larger than any known cave-dwelling creature. She could only estimate the full size of whatever left these marks. But when she later discovered similar impressions in underwater caves in 3 different locations, she famously declared that the giant cave serpent might be more than just legend. In recent years, previously unknown species of cave-dwelling amphibians have been documented growing up to 6 feet in length. Some expert estimations suggest they could potentially reach sizes of 10 feet or more in the deepest, most isolated cave systems. It's remarkable that the first live specimens of these creatures were only photographed as recently as 2021. But could they really be responsible for the ancient legends? It seems unlikely. These amphibians have never been observed in the larger cave chambers. They prefer narrow fissures at depths of between 200 and 500 feet. While they may appear fearsome, they primarily hunt smaller prey and are relatively docile creatures. The giant cave serpent appears to have been an exaggeration of their size and nature. But what else might be down there? After all, the legend existed long before we discovered these giant amphibians. So one might question what actually inspired these tales. In 2020, a tracking device attached to experienced cave diver Michael Drake was found washed up in a cave outflow in the Piku system. This was just 2 weeks after, and only a mile away from where he had begun his exploration. Conservation officials analyzed the data stored in the device and discovered something disturbing. During those first 2 weeks, Drake had been methodically mapping the underwater passages, rarely exceeding depths of 300 feet. However, at 2:15 a.m. on November 12th, the tracker showed him suddenly descending over a previously unknown vertical shaft to a depth of 600 feet in under 60 seconds, far faster than any diver could safely descend. Initial speculation suggested the device had simply detached, but this was quickly ruled out. If Drake couldn't have descended that rapidly, the device certainly wouldn't have sunk that fast on its own. More significantly, during the descent, the temperature remained steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, much warmer than the 52 degrees recorded during his previous dives. Given that the water should have grown colder at greater depths, if the device had simply fallen, it should have registered decreasing temperatures. When the tracker was examined, it was found to be corroded by an unknown chemical substance, suggesting it had been exposed to something other than normal cave water. This final detail led some to conclude that Drake might have been attacked by something large enough to swallow both him and his equipment. The question was, what? Some theorized he had become trapped in a powerful underground current, but the cave system's hydrology didn't support this explanation. 10 months later, speleologists believed they had solved the mystery, proposing that a massive underwater cave collapse had occurred. However, this theory also had problems. Firstly, no evidence of such a collapse was found during subsequent surveys. Secondly, the temperature readings remained inconsistent with any known geological process. Finally, similar incidents had been reported in the same cave system, dating back to 1972. These inconsistencies led some researchers to suggest that an unknown predatory species might inhabit these depths. The speculation intensified in 2021 when a scientific expedition in the Silent Depths cave complex had a frightening encounter with something extraordinary. Dr. Alex Fisher reported in the expedition log what happened on August 15th. Their team had been setting up underwater monitoring equipment when their most powerful light beam illuminated something massive moving through a large chamber, nearly 800 feet below the surface. Fisher described what they saw. The creature appeared to be over 40 feet in length, with a serpentine body and multiple appendages. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it moved with surprising agility for its size. Most disturbing were its features. A large, flattened head with what appeared to be primitive eye sockets. The entire team witnessed this, and our equipment recorded a significant temperature anomaly at the same moment. If Fisher's account, which was corroborated by his team members and sensor data, is accurate, then what they encountered sounds remarkably similar to prehistoric amphibians thought to have gone extinct millions of years ago. Similar creatures have reportedly been seen in deep cave systems across the globe, as recently as 2023, with multiple sightings documented by professional cavers and scientists alike. The scientific community generally dismisses these reports as misidentification of known cave-dwelling species. However, this explanation seems inadequate given that many eyewitnesses describe creatures exceeding 30 feet in length, far larger than any known modern amphibian. But these alleged underground monsters aren't limited to prehistoric animals. In early 2024, a research team exploring the newly discovered Abyss Cave complex reported encountering something even more extraordinary. The team's underwater cameras captured images of a large, humanoid figure moving through the darkness, nearly 400 feet below the surface. The being appeared to be roughly 12 feet tall, with elongated limbs and webbed appendages. Its skin was ghostly white, and it displayed clear signs of advanced adaptation to underground aquatic life. Because of its disturbing human-like characteristics, the research team designated it Echo Walker. Multiple sightings have been reported since, primarily in the deepest sections of various cave systems, leading some to speculate that an unknown species of cave-adapted humanoids might exist in these lightless realms. Photographic evidence exists, but the extreme conditions and poor visibility in these environments mean that most footage is inconclusive. If the Echo Walkers do exist, some researchers suggest they could represent an entirely new branch of underground evolved vertebrates. Of course, such sightings aren't limited to remote cave systems. There are numerous underground rivers throughout the world, thought to harbor unknown creatures. One of the most compelling cases emerged recently beneath the Carpathian Mountains. A series of remarkable sonar readings taken in 2023 revealed something massive moving through the underground river network. The readings suggested an organism at least 30 feet in length, displaying movement patterns unlike any known cave-dwelling species. Within the same week, 3 separate research teams reported unusual disturbances in different sections of the underground river system. Their observations described large, dark shapes moving against the current, accompanied by unexpected temperature fluctuations and unusual bioelectric readings. Wildlife experts were particularly intrigued by these incidents, as the depth and isolation of these water systems make them ideal harbors for relict species, living fossils that might have survived unchanged for millions of years. So what are we to make of all these underground water monsters? Is there any truth to these sightings? Or should we dismiss them all as misidentification and imagination? While there isn't enough concrete evidence to prove the existence of any of these creatures, the vast network of unexplored cave systems remains so inaccessible and mysterious that they might as well be on another planet. We simply don't know what lurks in those lightless depths. We cannot deny that the potential existence of unknown creatures in our underground waters has captured human imagination. There appears to be much left to discover, and possibly much more to fear. The next time you stand near a cave entrance or underground spring, take a moment to consider what might be moving through the darkness beneath your feet. If you travel to the frozen north today, you're in for a grim surprise. If you travel to the frozen north today, you'd better go well disguised. For when the earth is frozen solid and blanketed in white, you might find yourself in the hunting grounds of the frost stalker. According to ancient Sami legend, there was a dark and malevolent entity which possessed the power to control the minds of men and women. This creature stalked its victims during the coldest months, entering their dreams and drawing them out into the snow until they were lost and desperate for warmth. Once the victim's life force began to fade, there was no turning back. They would forever be transformed into a horrifying being, one which constantly craved human warmth with a hunger that was never satisfied. They would become what is known as a frost stalker, born of the indigenous Sami people that inhabited the harshest regions of northern Scandinavia. The frost stalker is a legend of dual nature. Its name refers to both the evil entity which possesses its victims and the physical creature they become after surrendering to the cold. The entity was attracted to two distinct types of people: those who were arrogant and selfish, and those who were vulnerable and freezing. It was said to haunt people in their sleep, filling their dreams with visions of warmth and comfort, luring them away from safety and into the deadly cold, starting with those they held dearest. The physical frost stalker, however, was far more terrifying. These were the remnants of those possessed by the entity, typically encountered in remote, snow-covered forests. They were described as unusually tall and emaciated, with bluish-white skin stretched tight over their bones. Their faces were recognizably human, but severely distorted, with hollow cheeks, eyes like frozen ponds, and cracked lips that had withered away, revealing jagged icicle teeth. Their fingers were long and slender, ending in translucent claws of ice, which were used to drain the warmth from their victims. Frost stalkers were said to be swift, powerful, and silent, able to pursue their targets across vast distances through the snow. They had been known to mimic the voices of loved ones, calling out in the blizzard to draw wanderers deeper into the wilderness. Although this was originally a folk tale used to explain the dangers of winter, the bitter cold, starvation, and the perils of isolation, as well as condemning selfishness, it has since evolved into something more substantial. Classified as a contemporary cryptid, people continue to report encounters with frost stalkers to this day. The question remains whether the legend is influencing these sightings, or if people are using the legend to make sense of something else they've witnessed. Finding reliable reports of these encounters proved challenging, as there are few well-documented incidents on record. But we did manage to uncover some accounts. None of the stories we are about to share is supported by concrete evidence. They are purely anecdotal, but intriguing nonetheless. The first of these encounters takes place in Finnish Lapland, near Lake Inari, submitted to an online forum in March of 2015. The user, Marcus Lindgren, states that he and his wife had relocated to the area the previous summer. The property came with about 5 hectares of land and was primarily surrounded by dense pine forest. They spent their first few months renovating the rustic cabin before settling in for what would prove to be an exceptionally harsh winter. The snowfall at the beginning of that year was the deepest the region had experienced in a generation. Their nearest neighbors lived about 3 kilometers further along Route 71, and the constant whiteout conditions only intensified their sense of isolation, though they actually enjoyed the solitude. The sun would disappear just after 3 p.m. during those midwinter evenings, and with the normal forest sounds muffled by the snow, an eerie deep blue twilight enveloped everything. Night after night around midnight on the 21st of January, Marcus reports that he was awakened by one of his dogs barking and pawing frantically at the front door. Assuming it needed to relieve itself, he left his wife sleeping and made his way downstairs. As soon as he opened the door, the dog bolted for the tree line surrounding the property, growling and barking at something in the darkness beyond. No matter how many times he called her back, she kept running without even glancing toward the house. After hurriedly pulling on his snow boots and grabbing a flashlight, he ran across his yard and soon found himself standing at the forest's edge, calling her name and shining his light between the trees. He could hear branches snapping in the distance as his dog moved through the underbrush, still growling and barking at whatever she sensed was there. But then suddenly, everything went quiet. He took a cautious step just inside the tree line and stood motionless for a moment, listening. There wasn't even a whisper on the wind. He advanced a few more steps, called again, and still heard nothing. He recounted that he must have walked another 7 meters before he found himself among a cluster of silver birch trees. And that's when he heard it. Kultasny. It was his wife's voice coming from behind him. He turned around, fully expecting to see her standing at the edge of the tree line, but there was no one there. Then he heard it a second time. Kultasny. At this point, he realized something was very wrong. Like before, it sounded as if it came from behind him, but now it was from deeper within the forest. He directed his flashlight into the branches, sweeping back and forth, when he suddenly noticed movement about 3 meters ahead of him. What he initially thought were branches straightened up to reveal a long, slender figure. When the beam passed over its face, the eyes reflected no light. They were just frozen, hollow orbs. He had no time to process what he was seeing as he turned and sprinted back toward the cabin, bursting from the tree line and racing across his open yard. Only when he reached his front door and found his dog sitting there waiting for him did he look back. But there was nothing there. When he went inside, he discovered his wife still soundly asleep in bed. Marcus ended his post saying, "I don't know if what I saw was a frost stalker, but it matches the description. It could have been a ghost or even some kind of alien. It might have been my imagination, but the sound of my wife's voice and those eyes, it was very real to me. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I can tell you that I haven't ventured back into those woods since." Later that same year, a man named Olaf Thorvaldsson would have a chilling experience while working in Femundsmarka National Park, Norway. Olaf worked as a forestry ranger, clearing and marking paths through the dense woodland in preparation for the summer tourist season. Unlike many of his colleagues, he lived far from the main office, and often spent his weekends in a remote ranger station, while everyone else returned to civilization. During December, the first heavy snows began to blanket the region, and it was just after 9 p.m. on the weekend of the 15th that Olaf would receive an unwelcome visitor. As he recalls, the snow was falling heavily, and he had just added another log to the wood stove. He was climbing back into his bunk to continue reading his book when he was startled by a heavy thud on the roof. After a brief moment of alarm, he reasoned that a clump of snow must have fallen from the branches of the pine tree overhanging the station, and thought nothing more of it. But about 5 minutes later, he was disturbed again, this time by a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound above his head. Again, he quickly dismissed it. Either some branches were scraping across the roof, or perhaps a wolverine had decided to brave the elements in search of food. In any case, the sound ceased abruptly after a few more minutes, and after another hour or so, Olaf decided to turn over and go to sleep. He had just closed his eyes when he was jolted awake by another loud thud, then another, and another, and another, and then silence. Olaf remembered a shiver running up his spine, as it sounded exactly like someone walking across the roof of the station. It was definitely not a wolverine. The thuds had been too heavy, and they sounded distinctly bipedal. He considered that someone might be playing a prank, but then he remembered just how isolated he was, and wondered who could possibly be out there at that hour, and in such weather. He knew he needed to investigate, but felt understandably apprehensive. For several minutes, he sat looking out of his window, hoping to detect any movement. Given the frigid temperatures, he was already fully dressed. He pulled on his boots, opened the door, and cautiously stepped out onto the porch. There he stood in the silent night, as the snow fell without a sound, knowing that something was out there watching him. There was nothing on the roof, but his attention was drawn to the high branches of a nearby pine. He couldn't distinguish anything in the darkness, and he never understood why, but for some inexplicable reason, he had the most overwhelming feeling that there was a presence observing him. He reached for his flashlight, but something prevented him. Somewhere in the recesses of his mind, he heard a voice warning him that if he illuminated the darkness, he would not survive until morning. Instead, he turned around and went back inside, securing the door behind him. Hours passed with no further disturbances, but he had been so unnerved by what he sensed that he couldn't even close his eyes. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him. He awoke several hours later, and looking out the window, was relieved to see that the first light of dawn was beginning to appear. The scene outside was peaceful and still, but in the half-light, he noticed on the porch just outside the door bare humanoid footprints in the fresh snow. And in that moment, he knew that something had been watching him while he slept. Although Olaf didn't actually see anything that night, when his colleagues returned the following Monday and he shared his experience, most of them laughed it off. A few, however, were deadly serious when they informed him that he had been visited by a frost stalker. Our final account comes from Eirik Gunnarsson, whose experience was published in a local newspaper nearly 25 years ago. Eirik was a hunter from Östersund, Sweden, born in 1939. He had spent decades hunting in the forests of Jämtland County. During that time, he had become thoroughly accustomed to the wilderness. He had heard numerous strange tales, about the northern forests. He had even heard unusual sounds on previous expeditions, but he had never witnessed anything out of the ordinary and dismissed the stories he had been told. Relatives described him as an honest, practical man with a straightforward approach to his pursuits. The account of his encounter was published some years after his death and was submitted by his daughter Astrid. It occurred in December 1983, while her father was on a hunting trip in the remote forests of Jämtland. Eirik was 3 days into this particular expedition when he experienced something he was never able to explain, and which prevented him from hunting alone for many years afterward. It was early afternoon, and progress had been difficult. He had tracked a large elk for quite some distance over challenging terrain which was covered in deep snow. He finally spotted his target when he approached the edge of a large clearing. Being some distance away and downwind of the animal, he had time to be patient as he carefully moved into position and aimed his Husqvarna rifle. When he finally took the shot, he was disappointed to see the elk flinch and then dash into the trees beyond. He had struck it in the side, but his aim had been slightly off. Still, if it was wounded, it would soon succumb to its injuries, and all Eirik had to do from that point was follow the trail of blood. He was about halfway across the clearing when things began to feel strange. He described the air seeming to turn heavy and dull, and everything becoming eerily silent. All the typical forest sounds vanished, and he was suddenly overcome by an unusual sense of exposure, as if he was being watched. He continued forward, but not without considerable unease. Just inside the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing, he saw the elk lying on its side, its flanks heaving as warm breath, visible in the frigid air, escaped from its nostrils. He approached to within 10 meters of the dying animal, hunting knife in hand, when he noticed something unusual just behind the elk. There was a mass of pale blue-white which at first glance resembled a drift of snow, but now he could see that it was moving, as if attached to the wounded elk. He advanced just a few steps closer before stopping completely. His jaw dropped as he watched an inhuman face rise up from behind his kill. It had frost around its mouth, and according to Eirik, wore the most malevolent expression he had ever encountered. It suddenly shifted into a protective stance, crouching over the elk as if claiming it. It then emitted a high-pitched howl that sounded like wind through an ice cave, which was enough to send Eirik running for the opposite side of the clearing. He managed to return to his camp and cut his trip short. As far as his daughter knew, Eirik never hunted in those woods again. When describing the creature, her father recalled that it was incredibly gaunt, and even though it was crouched low, he could tell it was unnaturally tall. Its skin was almost as pale blue-white as the snow around it. He would often recount this story to his closest family, even as he was dying from lung cancer in his final days. He would share this tale one last time with absolute conviction. So what are we to make of these accounts? Are they merely fabricated stories? Or did these individuals actually encounter something in the northern forests? For us, the main issue with alleged frost stalker sightings is that we know this entity is simply a legend. In the original folklore, the frost stalker did not possess a physical form at all. It existed only as a spiritual force. Its material manifestation only developed later, and even then, there are multiple descriptions regarding its appearance. While most Sami traditions described it as portrayed in this account, others claimed it resembled a frost-covered mountain troll. And particularly in recent years, and especially since the digital age, modern descriptions suggest that it has a crown of icicles and glowing blue eyes. Unlike some other folkloric creatures, frost stalkers cannot change their form. So these inconsistencies in appearance only further challenge the credibility of its physical existence. Before modern medicine, many illnesses and psychological conditions were attributed to malevolent spirits. And with this in mind, it's easy to understand how the legend persisted. Northern Scandinavia experiences brutally cold winters, and there would certainly have been periods when food was scarce in such harsh conditions. This perhaps led some individuals to become so desperate that they ventured out unprepared, becoming lost and succumbing to hypothermia, an occurrence viewed as a terrible fate. It's possible that the legend originated from a need to both explain and prevent these tragedies, as well as to establish values against selfishness and hoarding of resources, encouraging people instead to share their provisions for the community's welfare. That said, could people be encountering something real in the forests and incorrectly associating these experiences with the frost stalker? After all, the wilderness areas of northern Europe are incredibly vast, with regions that remain largely unexplored. It's not difficult to imagine the possibility of some unknown entity still existing deep within those remote areas, or possibly something else entirely non-human. There are some recorded testimonies which might suggest this possibility, and while they may be nothing more than fabrications, they are rather compelling. All the records we are about to discuss have been linked to possible frost stalker encounters. This audio recording was discovered in 1979 and captures a group of hikers at a remote cabin. At one point, an unusual vocalization is heard, just as a humanoid figure is allegedly recorded moving on all fours in the background, circling around the campsite. The recording could be authentic. However, we find it unusual that there appears to be little reaction from the group, despite the clear sounds of something approaching. Also, the way the recording device seems to be positioned toward the forest, rather than focusing on the conversation around the fire, makes this seem somewhat staged. The following was documented in January 2011 and describes a team of researchers exploring an abandoned weather station. They begin to hear strange sounds coming from another part of the building, and when they investigate, they encounter something that sends them fleeing. The account is somewhat vague, and we don't get a clear description of what they saw. The whole situation seems contrived and follows predictable patterns, so we believe this is likely fabricated. The next piece of evidence was a photograph taken in 2003 at a remote cemetery surrounded by pine forest, and the photographer only noticed something unusual when he examined the image 6 years after it was taken. It appears to show a humanoid figure peering from behind a headstone, which many people have described as having inhuman features, while others have identified it as a frost stalker. The time gap between capturing and analyzing the photo is interesting, but it could easily be someone standing behind the grave marker, positioning a mannequin in the frame before removing it when the camera moves. This final record was found in a journal from the mid-1990s, No one has claimed ownership of the writing, and the author has never been identified. It describes a couple hiking through the forest and coming face to face with a strange entity, which then proceeds to pursue them. The journal entry ends abruptly. If this is a hoax, it is very convincingly written, but a potential clue is the description of the creature's sounds, which are remarkably detailed and dramatic compared to the practical tone of the rest of the writing. When all is said and done, it appears the legend of the frost stalker is precisely that, a legend. It endures today in Sami folklore and internet horror stories. It also gives its name to an actual medical condition known as frost stalker syndrome, where the sufferer develops an irrational fear of freezing to death or becoming lost in winter conditions. And for most people, that's as real as it gets. On the other hand, we can't help but wonder whether the legend evolved from deeper truths. Was there something more that the Sami people understood? Could there be something waiting in those frozen forests? You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.